There is a name buried beneath the shadow of a giant, a name that history chose to forget, a name that struck more fear into David's army than even Goliath himself. LAHMI. Everyone knows Goliath, the giant who fell to a shepherd boy's stone, the champion of Gath, the warrior whose name became legend. But Goliath had a brother, and he was worse. The Bible records it in a single verse, easy to miss. Elhanan, son of Jair, killed LAHMI, the brother of Goliath. But here's what that verse doesn't tell you. Elhanan wasn't just some soldier. He was one of David's mighty men, an elite warrior, a giant killer in his own right. Because when LAHMI came to the battlefield, David himself couldn't face him. Not alone. Not like he did with Goliath. Why? What made LAHMI so dangerous that it took David's best warrior to bring him down? Why is Goliath remembered in every Sunday school while his brother, possibly more deadly, was erased from history? And here's the question that haunts the text. If Goliath fell to a boy with a sling, why did LAHMI require a trained killer? Before we begin, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? Have you ever heard of LAHMI before? Did you know Goliath had a brother? Now close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and come with me to a battlefield where the shadow of one giant fell, but another still stood. This is the entire story of LAHMI, Goliath's forgotten brother, why David's army couldn't defeat him alone. Let's begin. In the shadows of one of history's most famous battles, there exists a name that almost no one remembers. While the entire world knows the story of David and Goliath, the shepherd boy who felled a giant with a single stone, buried in the biblical text is another giant, another battle, another name that history nearly forgot. LAHMI, Goliath's brother. The texts describe him as a warrior so formidable that David himself, now king, now commander of armies, now the legendary giant slayer, couldn't face him alone. According to the biblical account, it would take one of David's elite warriors, a man named Elhanan, to bring him down. But here's where the story becomes strange. In 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 19, the text appears to say that Elhanan killed Goliath, not LAHMI. Yet in 1 Chronicles 20:5, the same battle is described, but now the giant's name is LAHMI, identified explicitly as the brother of Goliath. For thousands of years, scribes, scholars, and translators have wrestled with these verses. Is this a contradiction, a scribal error, two different traditions trying to explain the same event? Or is there something deeper here, a forgotten war, a family of giants, a pattern of battles that the biblical narrative only partially preserves? This is not a story about what is true. This is a story about what the ancient texts say, what early communities believe, and why the figure of LAHMI, obscure, nearly forgotten, mentioned in passing, might actually be one of the most significant characters in understanding the biblical narrative of giants, warfare, and the price of forbidden knowledge. What these texts describe, what the traditions preserve, is not just the tale of one giant's brother. It's a window into an ancient world where the memory of beings called Nephilim, Rephaim, and Anakim haunted the collective consciousness of entire people, where certain bloodlines were believed to carry something other than human, where battles were not just political or territorial, but cosmic, struggles against remnants of a corrupted order that, according to tradition, should have been destroyed in the flood. To understand LAHMI, we must first understand where he came from. Not just his family line, but the deeper story that biblical and apocryphal traditions tell about giants, who they were, where they came from, and why their presence on earth was seen as an existential threat. Let's begin where all giant stories in the Judeo-Christian tradition begin. Before the flood, in a world the ancient texts describe as so corrupted, so fundamentally broken, that divine intervention became necessary on a catastrophic scale. Genesis chapter 6 opens with one of the most enigmatic passages in all of biblical literature. Verses 1 through 4 describe a time when, in the words of the text, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Who were these sons of God? The Hebrew term is Beni Elohim, a phrase that appears elsewhere in the book of Job to describe divine beings who present themselves before God's throne. In Job 1:6 we read, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them." The same term, the same Hebrew construction. The Genesis text continues with a statement that has puzzled readers for millennia. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. For thousands of years, Jewish and Christian scholars have debated what this passage means. The earliest interpretations, found in texts like the Book of Enoch, preserved by Ethiopian Orthodox Christians and mentioned in the New Testament Book of Jude, describe a dramatic event. Divine beings who, according to the narrative, left their proper domain, descended to earth, and produced offspring that the ancient world came to fear. The Book of Enoch, dated by most scholars to the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, but claiming to preserve much older traditions, provides extensive detail about what the biblical text only hints at. According to Enoch chapters 6 through 10, 200 of these beings, called watchers, descended to Mount Hermon. The text describes them swearing an oath together, binding themselves to a course of action they knew was forbidden. The narrative in Enoch names their leaders: Semjaza, Azazel, Armaros, Barakijel, Cockabeel, Tamiel, Ramiel, Danel, Chazakiel, and others. It describes them taking human wives and producing offspring, the Nephilim, who grew to enormous size. The text states that these giants consumed all the acquisitions of men, and when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. Whether this is literal history, allegory, or ancient mythology is debated across different faith traditions and scholarly circles. But what's undeniable is that this narrative shaped how ancient Near Eastern peoples understood their world, their fears, their conflicts, their understanding of boundaries between the divine and human realms. The Book of Enoch goes further, describing how these watchers taught humanity knowledge that the tradition considers forbidden. Azazel, according to the text, taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and armor, the technology of warfare. He taught women the art of cosmetics and jewelry, which the text frames as vanity and deception. Other watchers taught enchantments, astrology, the cutting of roots, and the interpretation of signs. The tradition holds that this knowledge was premature, that humanity was not ready for such power, such capability, such understanding. And the result, according to these ancient sources, was catastrophe. Violence spread across the earth. The Nephilim, part divine, part human, fitting fully into neither category, became tyrants. The text describes the earth as filled with their violence, their bloodshed, their corruption. Genesis 6:5-6 provides the biblical narrative's assessment. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. Scholars note this is anthropomorphic language, describing divine response in human terms that ancient audiences could understand. Different theological traditions interpret this verse differently, with some seeing it as literal divine emotion, and others as literary device expressing the severity of the situation. What follows is the flood narrative, the story of Noah, the ark, the destruction of all life except what was preserved in that vessel. According to the tradition, the flood was not random. It was a response, a reset, an attempt to, in the words these ancient texts use, cleanse the earth of corruption and violence. The book of Enoch describes the Nephilim dying in the flood, but their spirits, not fully human, not fully divine, becoming what later tradition would call demons, wandering the earth without bodies, causing harm wherever they could. But that's a later development. For now, the biblical narrative presents the flood as ending the age of the Nephilim. Except it didn't. Because Numbers chapter 13, centuries later in the biblical timeline, records an event that reignites the entire question. The Israelites, having escaped Egypt and wandered the wilderness for a generation, stand on the border of Canaan. Moses sends 12 spies into the land to scout it out, to assess what awaits them. 10 of the spies return with a terrifying report. Numbers 13:32-33 records their words. The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Same name, same description, Nephilim. This raises a question that scholars have wrestled with for millennia. If the Nephilim were destroyed in the flood, how do they appear again? What survived? Or did something new begin? The biblical text itself offers a clue in Genesis 6:4, that enigmatic verse we looked at earlier. Let's read it again, paying attention to a detail often overlooked. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had child, rend by them. And also afterward. That phrase, added almost as an aside, suggests the Nephilim weren't just a pre-flood phenomenon. The tradition preserved in the text indicates their presence continued after the flood. But how? One interpretation, found in various Jewish sources, suggests that Noah's sons or their wives might have carried the genetic potential for gigantism. Another theory, preserved in some texts, suggests that the sons of God repeated their transgression after the flood, though this view is less widely held. A third perspective argues that Nephilim became a general term for giants, and the post-flood giants were a separate phenomenon sharing only a name and characteristic with the pre-flood beings. What's clear from the biblical narrative is that when the Israelites arrived at Canaan's borders, giants were waiting for them. And these weren't just tall people. The texts describe beings whose size inspired absolute terror in trained warriors, men who had survived slavery, witnessed the plagues on Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, and endured 40 years in the wilderness. Numbers 13 identifies these giants as descendants of Anak. The text states, "The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim." This establishes a lineage, a bloodline, a genealogy connecting the post-flood giants to the pre-flood Nephilim. Who was Anak? Deuteronomy 2:10-11 provides context. The Amites used to live there, a people strong and numerous and as tall as the Anakites. Like the Anakites, they too were considered Rephates, but the Moabites called them Amites. Here the text introduces another term, Rephates or Rephaim. This word appears throughout the biblical text to describe various groups of giants. The tradition suggests the Rephaim were a broad category, and the Anakites were one specific clan or family line within that category. Deuteronomy 2:20-21 continues. That too was considered a land of the Rephates who used to live there, but the Ammonites called them Zamzamites. They were a people strong and numerous and as tall as the Anakites. But the Lord destroyed them from before the Ammonites, who drove them out and settled in their place. The biblical text describes these giants as widespread throughout the region, known by different names to different peoples, but sharing common characteristics: extraordinary size, military prowess, and a presence that inspired fear in entire populations. Amos 2:9 offers another description, using poetic language. "Yet I destroyed the Amorites before them, though they were tall as the cedars and strong as the oaks. I destroyed their fruit above and their roots below." Tall as the cedars. Cedar trees in Lebanon can reach 120 feet. This is clearly poetic exaggeration, using the language of hyperbole to express extraordinary height. But the consistent emphasis across multiple biblical texts, written by different authors in different time periods, describing different locations, suggests that the tradition of giants in Canaan was deeply embedded in Israelite cultural memory. Now let's pause here and consider what we're dealing with from a historical and archaeological perspective, setting aside theological questions for a moment. Ancient Near Eastern texts outside the Bible also reference unusual people. The Egyptian execration texts from the Middle Kingdom period mention various groups in Canaan. The Amarna letters from the 14th century BCE describe conflicts and peoples in the region. Mesopotamian texts describe various populations. But here's what's interesting. We don't have clear archaeological evidence for a distinct population of people whose skeletal remains show uniform gigantism. We have occasional finds of individuals with genetic conditions causing extreme height, like acromegaly or gigantism resulting from pituitary issues. We have evidence of well-nourished populations who might have been taller on average than their neighbors, but nothing suggesting a distinct race of giants in the way the biblical texts describe. So how do we make sense of this? One perspective suggests the giant narratives are symbolic, representing the military power, advanced technology, or political dominance of Canaan's inhabitants. When the Israelites, fresh from the wilderness, encountered fortified cities, iron chariots, and professional armies, they might have expressed this disparity through the language of giants. The spy's report would then be understood as saying, "We can't defeat these. They're too powerful, too advanced, too overwhelming." Another perspective argues that there might have been populations with genetic predispositions toward greater height, and over generations of storytelling, these became exaggerated into the giant narratives we now read. Think of how quickly fishermen's stories grow. The one that got away becomes bigger with each retelling. Applied over centuries to tribal memories of formidable enemies, relatively tall warriors could become giants' and the narrative tradition. A third perspective takes the texts more literally, suggesting there were individuals of extraordinary size, perhaps suffering from genetic conditions, perhaps from unique bloodlines, who led or symbolized these people, and whose presence defined how these groups were remembered and described. Different scholars, different faith traditions, different interpretive communities approach these questions differently. What matters for our story is understanding what the tradition itself claims and preserves. Because according to the biblical narrative, when the Israelites finally entered Canaan under Joshua's leadership, they faced these giants in battle. And the text describes a systematic campaign to eliminate them. Joshua 11:21-22 records. At that time Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, and Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua totally destroyed them and their towns. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. Let's pay close attention to those last words. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. 3 cities, Philistine cities, cities that would become Israel's enemies for generations. Gath, remember that name, because according to 1 Samuel 17:4, that's where Goliath came from. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. The text is connecting dots across centuries of narrative. The Anakites, descendants of the Nephilim according to the tradition, survived in Philistine territory, specifically in Gath, and from Gath came Goliath. 1 Samuel 17 provides Goliath's measurements. He was over 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels, 9 feet tall. Some manuscripts say 6 cubits and a span, which calculates to roughly 9 feet 9 inches. Other manuscripts, including the Dead Sea Scrolls version and the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation, record 4 cubits and a span, approximately 6 feet 9 inches, which is tall but not impossible. Scholars debate which measurement is original. The point isn't settling that debate here. The point is understanding how the tradition remembered Goliath. As a giant, as a warrior of extraordinary size and strength, as a figure whose very presence inspired terror in the entire Israelite army. The famous story unfolds. David, still a youth, volunteers to fight Goliath. He refuses Saul's armor, takes 5 smooth stones, and approaches the giant with his shepherd's sling. Goliath mocks him. David declares he comes in the name of the Lord. He slings 1 stone, strikes Goliath in the forehead, and the giant falls. David then uses Goliath's own sword to decapitate him. It's one of the most famous underdog stories in human literature. It's been preached in synagogues, churches, and mosques. It's been painted, sculpted, filmed, and retold countless times. It represents faith over fear, skill over strength, God's power over human might. But the story doesn't end there, because according to the biblical text, Goliath had brothers. 2 Samuel 21, 15-22 describes a series of battles between David's men and the Philistine. Verse 15 sets the scene. Once again, there was a battle between the Philistines and Israel. David went down with his men to fight against the Philistine, and he became exhausted. David is older now. He's been king for years. The text describes him as exhausted in battle, no longer the young warrior who could fight all day, but a ruler whose strength is waning. Verse 16 continues, And Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of Rapha, whose bronze spearhead weighed 300 shekels and who was armed with a new sword, said he would kill David. Rapha, another name for the giant clans, related to the Rephaim we discussed earlier. This warrior, Ishbi-Benob, targets David specifically. The king of Israel is in danger. Verse 17 records, But Abishai son of Zeruiah came to David's rescue. He struck the Philistine down and killed him. Then David's men swore to him, saying, Never again will you go out with us to battle, so that the lamp of Israel will not be extinguished. David's own men recognize the danger. The giant slayer has become vulnerable. They forbid him from going to battle, not because he's weak, but because he's too valuable to risk. Then comes verse 18. In the course of time, there was another battle with the Philistines at Gob. At that time Sibek, Ai the Hushathite, killed Saph, who was one of the descendants of Rapha, another giant, another of David's elite warriors defeating. Verse 19 is where our story truly begins. In another battle with the Philistines at Gob, Elhanan son of Jair the Bethlehemite killed the brother of Goliath the Gittite, who had a spear with a shaft like a weaver's rod. Read that again carefully. Elhanan son of Jair the Bethlehemite killed the brother of Goliath. But here's where it gets complicated. The Hebrew text of 2 Samuel 21:19 is difficult. Some translations render it as saying Elhanan killed Goliath himself, not his brother. The text reads, Elhanan son of Yairorjam the Bethlehemite killed Goliath the Gittite, whose spear shaft was like a weaver's beam. This creates an apparent contradiction with 1 Samuel 17, where David killed Goliath. Jewish scribes noticed this discrepancy centuries ago. Christian scholars debated it. Muslim commentators, when discussing biblical texts, noted it. The solution appears in 1 Chronicles 20:5, which describes the same battle but with a crucial difference. In another battle with the Philistines, Elhanan son of Jair killed LAHMI, the brother of Goliath the Gittite, who had a spear with a shaft like a weaver's rod. LAHMI, the brother of Goliath. Most scholars believe 1 Chronicles preserves the correct reading. The text in 2 Samuel likely suffered a scribal error during transmission. Letters were dropped or confused, transforming LAHMI, the brother of Goliath, into Goliath. Ancient Hebrew was written without vowels, and small changes in consonants could significantly alter meaning. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in caves near Qumran in the mid-20th century, provide some of the oldest surviving manuscripts of biblical texts. While we don't have a Dead Sea Scroll fragment of this specific verse, the scrolls demonstrate that textual variations did exist in biblical manuscripts, and that scribes sometimes made errors or incorporated different traditions. What matters for understanding the narrative is this: the tradition preserved in Chronicles identifies LAHMI as Goliath's brother, killed by Elhanan rather than by David. This isn't the only giant battle described in this passage. Verse 20 continues, "In still another battle which took place at Gath, there was a huge man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. He also was descended from Rapha." 6 fingers, 6 toes, 24 digits total. The text describes this as a physical characteristic, a marker that identifies this warrior as part of the giant lineage. Polydactyly, extra fingers or toes, is a real genetic condition, occurring in roughly 1 in 500 to 1 in 1,000 live births. It can run in families. Was this giant's polydactyly coincidental, or does it suggest a genetic component to the giant lineages the text describes? We can't know with certainty. What we can observe is that the text uses physical distinctiveness, extraordinary height, unusual weapons, and in this case, extra digits, to identify these warriors as belonging to a specific group, a bloodline that the Israelites believed traced back to the Anakim, to the Nephilim, to a corrupted order from before the flood. Verse 21 records the death of this unnamed giant. When he taunted Israel, Jonathan, son of Shimea, David's brother, killed him. Another of David's family members. Another giant defeat. Verse 22 summarizes, "These 4 were descendants of Rapha and Gath, and they fell at the hands of David and his men." 4 giants, 4 battles, 4 descendants of Rapha from Gath. But only one of them is given a name that connects him directly to the most famous giant of all, LAHMI, brother of Goliath. Why does this matter? Why does this obscure figure deserve attention when history has barely remembered him? Because LAHMI represents something crucial in the biblical narrative: the pattern of giants, the continuation of bloodlines that were supposed to be destroyed, and the reality that David, for all his legendary status as a giant slayer, couldn't face every giant alone. The young David who killed Goliath became the aging David who needed rescue from Ishbi-Benob. The shepherd boy who conquered with faith and a sling became the king who required elite warriors to fight battles he could no longer fight himself. And LAHMI, Goliath's brother, represents the transition. He wasn't defeated by the legend. He was defeated by someone else, a warrior named Elhanan, whose story is barely told, whose name appears in passing, but whose deed was significant enough to be recorded in the biblical text alongside the other giant killings. Let's take a moment to consider what we know about Elhanan. The text identifies him as son of Jair in Chronicles, though 2 Samuel calls him son of Jar-Rorjam, likely another textual variation. He's from Bethlehem, the same town David came from. He's one of David's mighty men, the elite warriors who fought the king's most dangerous battles. 2 Samuel 23 and 1 Chronicles 11 list David's mighty men, his special forces, the soldiers whose deeds were so remarkable they earned individual mention. The lists include names like Josheb-Basshebeth, who killed 800, Edmen in one encounter, Eleazar, who fought beside David until his hand froze to his sword, Abishai, who killed 300 men with his spear, and Benaiah, who killed a lion in a pit on a snowy day and struck down a 7.5-foot Egyptian with the Egyptian's own spear. Elhanan is listed among these mighty men. His primary claim to fame, according to the text, is killing LAHMI, the brother of Goliath. Think about what this tells us about LAHMI. If Elhanan earned a place among David's elite warriors for killing him, LAHMI must have been a formidable opponent. The text doesn't give us details of the battle, no description of tactics, no account of how the fight unfolded, no record of words exchanged. We only know the outcome. Elhanan killed LAHMI, who had a spear like a weaver's rod, just like his famous brother. The spear detail is repeated for both Goliath and LAHMI. A spear with a shaft like a weaver's rod. What does this mean? Weaver's rods, or beams, were heavy wooden pieces used to hold thread taut on ancient looms. They needed to be thick, strong, and substantial. Comparing a spear shaft to a weaver's beam suggests a weapon far larger and heavier than normal spears, so heavy that most men couldn't wield it, let alone throw it effectively. This detail connects the brothers. Both carried oversized weapons. Both came from Gath. Both were giants descended from Rapha, and both died fighting against Israel, one killed by the legendary king, the other by one of his elite warriors. But there's another detail worth noticing. The passage in 2 Samuel 21 lists 4 giants killed in these battles: Ishbi-benob, Saph, LAHMI, or Goliath in the Hebrew, but understood through Chronicles to be LAHMI, and the unnamed giant with 6 fingers and 6 toes. All 4 are described as descendants of Rapha. All 4 were from Gath. 4 giants from one city, from one bloodline. How many more were there? The text doesn't say. We only know about the ones who died fighting David's men. But the pattern suggests Gath was a stronghold for these giant clans, a place where the Anakim, those survivors that Joshua's conquest didn't destroy, maintained their presence and power. Remember what we read earlier from Joshua 11:22. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. 3 Philistine cities preserved the giants: Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. These became the core of Philistine power, the cities that opposed Israel for generations. And according to the tradition, they housed the descendants of the Anakim, the remnants of the Nephilim bloodline. This explains why the Philistines were such formidable enemies. It wasn't just their iron weapons or their military organization or their coastal position that gave them advantages. According to the biblical narrative, they had giants. They had warriors descended from bloodlines that other nations feared. They had the physical and military capability that came from those bloodlines. 1 Samuel 13:19-22 describes Israel's disadvantage during Saul's reign. Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, "Otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears." So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plow points, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened. So on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. The Philistines controlled iron technology. They monopolized weapon production. Israel fought at a severe technological disadvantage. But beyond technology, according to the texts, they also had the advantage of giants, warriors whose size and strength made them battlefield dominators. When Goliath challenged Israel in 1 Samuel 17, he wasn't just a lone warrior seeking glory. The text describes him as their champion, their representative in single combat. The Philistines trusted him to fight for them because they knew his capabilities. They'd seen him in battle. They knew what he could do. And when David killed him, the shock reverberated through both armies. The Philistines fled. Israel pursued. The giant was dead. The impossible had happened. But the giant bloodline didn't end with Goliath's death. His brothers remained. LAHMI remained. The other descendants of Rapha and Gath remained. And they continued to pose a threat severe enough that David's elite warriors had to face them in individual combat. This raises fascinating questions about family and revenge. Did LAHMI seek to avenge his brother's death? The text doesn't explicitly say, but consider the pattern. Ishbi-Benob specifically targeted David, seeking to kill him. Was this personal? Was this revenge for Goliath? The text identifies him as a descendant of Rapha, but doesn't call him Goliath's brother. Yet his targeting of David specifically suggests a personal dimension to the conflict. Perhaps all these giants from Gath saw David as their primer. Why enemy? Perhaps Goliath's death became a rallying point, a reason to seek out the king of Israel in battle. Perhaps LAHMI carried his brother's legacy, wielding a similar spear, fighting in a similar style, representing the same bloodline and the same threat. Or perhaps these battles were less personal and more systematic, a continuation of the conflict between Israel and the giant clans that had begun with Joshua, that had continued through the period of the Judges, and that reached its crescendo during David's reign. What we can say with certainty, based on the text, is that David's victory over Goliath didn't end the giant threat. It began a series of battles that would stretch across years, requiring the skill and courage of multiple warriors to finally eliminate the giant bloodlines from Gath. Let's consider the chronology. 1 Samuel 17 records David killing Goliath early in his life. He's still young, still a shepherd, not yet a soldier or king. The events of 2 Samuel 21 occur much later, after David has become king, after years of warfare, after establishing his dynasty. This means decades passed between Goliath's death and these later giant battles. LAHMI would have been alive during his brother's death. He would have heard the news. He would have known that Israel's future king had killed Goliath with a sling stone and then decapitated him with his own sword. How did that knowledge shape LAHMI? Did he train harder knowing Israel had produced a giant killer? Did he modify his fighting style? Did he swear revenge? The text doesn't answer these questions, but it does preserve his name, LAHMI, and identifies him specifically as Goliath's brother, suggesting his identity mattered, that his connection to the famous giant was significant enough to record. And here's what makes LAHMI's story particularly striking. When he finally faced an Israelite warrior in battle, it wasn't David. David wasn't there. David was specifically forbidden by his men from going into battle after the near-death experience with Ishbi-Benob. So LAHMI, brother of the giant David had killed, never got to face David in combat. Instead, he faced Elhanan, and Elhanan killed him. There's a strange justice in the legendary giant slayer doesn't get all the glory. The regular soldiers, the elite warriors who fought beside their king, also have their victories, their triumphs, their contributions to Israel's survival. The biblical narrative is often misread as focusing exclusively on heroes, Moses, Joshua, David, Solomon. But embedded in the text are countless other figures whose deeds mattered, whose courage made the difference, whose names are preserved even if briefly. Elhanan is one of these. He's not the star of the story, but he's the one who killed Goliath's brother, and that matters. It matters because it shows that David's victory over Goliath, while legendary, was part of a larger pattern. It wasn't a singular miracle that solved all problems. It was one battle in a longer war, and that war required many warriors, many battles, many victories. The text summarizes this in 2 Samuel 21:22. These four were descendants of Rapha and Gath, and they fell at the hands of David and his men. David and his men, not David alone, not just the king, but the king and his warriors together, each contributing their skill, each facing their giant, each playing their role in eliminating the threat these bloodlines posed. This is where the story of LAHMI intersects with the larger narrative about giants in biblical tradition. It's not just about individual warriors or individual battles. It's about a systematic campaign, stretching across centuries, from Joshua to David, to eliminate what the tradition describes as corrupted bloodlines, remnants of a pre-flood order, threats to human flourishing. Whether we understand this literally or symbolically, historically or mythologically, the pattern is clear. The biblical narrative presents the giant clans as an existential threat that required divine assistance and human courage to overcome. Joshua's conquest specifically targeted the Anakim in the hill country. The text describes their destruction as thorough, systematic, deliberate, except in the Philistine cities where they survived. Those survivors became the giants David's generation faced: Goliath, LAHMI, Ishbi-Benob, Saph, the unnamed warrior with 24 digits, all descended from Rapha, all from Gath, all requiring elite warriors to defeat. And after these battles, the text records no more giants. The bloodline, according to the narrative, was finally eliminated. The threat that had persisted since the days of Joshua was neutralized during David's reign. This completion of what Joshua started makes David's reign a pivotal moment. He wasn't just a warrior king who expanded Israel's borders, or a poet who wrote psalms, or a leader who prepared for the temple's construction. He was also, according to the tradition, the king who finally ended the giant threat, not alone, but through his mighty men, including Elhanan, who killed LAHMI. Let's pause here and think about what this means for understanding ancient Israelite worldview. The persistence of giants in the narrative, from the Nephilim before the flood, to the Anakim at Canaan's conquest, to the descendants of Rapha in David's time, suggests that the ancient Israelites saw themselves as living in a world where the consequences of pre-flood corruption hadn't fully resolved. The flood was supposed to cleanse the earth, but something survived, either genetically through Noah's line carrying the potential for giants, or through a repetition of the original transgression, or simply through the survival of giant bloodlines in specific regions. However the tradition explains it, the problem persisted. And this persistence meant that every generation faced the question, what do we do about the giants? For Joshua's generation, the answer was military conquest. Destroy the Anakim wherever they're found. Drive them from the land. The text describes this mission as divinely commanded, not merely a matter of human preference or political expansion. For David's generation, the answer was individual combat between elite warriors and giant champions. The battles were personal, named, remembered. Ishbi-Benob versus David and Abishai, Saph versus Sibbecai, LAHMI versus Elhanan, the unnamed giant versus Jonathan. These weren't random skirmishes. According to the narrative's framing, they were the final confrontations in a conflict that stretched back centuries, back to Mount Hermon where the Watchers descended, back to the days when the earth was filled with violence, back to the decision to send a flood and start again. And LAHMI, brother of Goliath, was part of that final chapter. He was one of the last, one of the descendants of Rapha who had to be defeated before Israel could finally live without the giant threat looming over them. The text doesn't describe what happened after these battles in detail, but the absence is itself significant. After 2 Samuel 21, giants disappear from the biblical narrative. They're no longer a threat. They're no longer mentioned as living enemies. They become part of history, part of memory, part of the past rather than the present. This suggests that David's mighty men, including Elhanan, succeeded in their mission. The giants were eliminated. The bloodlines ended. The threat that had persisted since Joshua's time was finally neutralized. But before we conclude this first part of our exploration, we need to circle back to a question that modern readers often ask. What actually happened? Were there really giants? Or is this ancient mythology? Is this symbolic language for political or military threats? Is this exaggerated memory of unusually tall people? Is this literal history? Different interpreters, different faith traditions, Different scholarly approaches answer these questions differently. Here's what we can say with some certainty. First, ancient Near Eastern cultures widely used the language of giants and divine beings to describe their enemies and their histories. This wasn't unique to Israel. Mesopotamian texts describe powerful kings as divine or semi-divine. Egyptian texts portray pharaohs as gods. Greek mythology is filled with demigods and giants. The ancient world understood and communicated through mythological frameworks that modern secular thought often strips away. Second, the biblical texts treat the giants as literal, historical figures. The narratives don't present them as myths or symbols, but as real enemies that real people fought. Whether the original authors intended this literally, or whether later readers understood it literally, the texts themselves present these figures as part of historical narrative. Third, we have no archaeological evidence of a distinct race of giants. We have some skeletal remains of individuals with genetic conditions causing extreme height, 7 feet, 8 feet, occasionally more, but nothing suggesting uniform populations of people consistently 9 or 10 feet tall. Fourth, the consistency of giant traditions across centuries of biblical text, from Genesis to Chronicles, suggests this was deeply embedded in Israelite cultural memory. These weren't random stories. They were part of how Israel understood its history, its enemies, and its survival. So where does that leave us with LAHMI? If we take the text at face value, LAHMI was Goliath's brother, a giant warrior from Gath, descended from the bloodlines that traced back to the Anakim and ultimately to the Nephilim. He wielded a massive spear and fought against Israel until Elhanan, one of David's mighty men, killed him in battle. If we interpret the text symbolically, LAHMI represents the ongoing threat of Philistine military power, the continuation of dangers that Israel faced, and the reality that defeating one champion didn't eliminate the entire threat. It required sustained effort, multiple victory, many warriors contributing their strength. If we interpret the text as exaggerated historical memory, LAHMI might have been an unusually large Philistine warrior, perhaps suffering from gigantism, whose size and skill made him legendary, and whose connection to another famous warrior, Goliath, caused later tradition to identify them as brothers. The text itself doesn't resolve these interpretive questions. It simply presents LAHMI as Goliath's brother, records his death at Elhanan's hands, and moves on. But that brief mention, those few verses, open a window into a much larger world. A world where Israel believed giants walked the earth, where bloodlines mattered, where some enemies were more than human or less than human or somehow both at once, where warfare had cosmic dimensions, not just political ones. The texts describe a world before the flood, a world where boundaries were crossed, where the natural order was disrupted, where something happened that required divine intervention on a catastrophic scale. According to these traditions, the flood was not random. It was a response, a reset, an attempt to restore what had been corrupted. But the story doesn't end with the flood, because in Numbers 13, centuries later, the Israelites encounter the Nephilim again. Same name, same description, which raises a question that scholars have wrestled with for millennia. If these beings were destroyed in the flood, how do they appear again? What survived? Or did something new begin? And that question leads us to the giants at Canaan's conquest, to the Anakim in the hill country, to the descendants of Rapha in the Philistine cities, to Goliath and his brothers, including LAHMI, who represented the final generation of these giant bloodlines. The tradition holds that David's mighty men, by defeating these last giants, completed what Joshua started. They eliminated the threat. They ended the bloodlines. They closed the chapter on a conflict that, according to the narrative, had persisted for over 1,000 years. LAHMI, brother of Goliath, was part of that final chapter. He was one of the last. His name, almost forgotten, barely recorded, mentioned in passing, deserves to be remembered because it represents the end of something ancient, something the biblical tradition describes as fundamentally opposed to the divine order. That is where the mystery deepens, because if LAHMI and his brothers were the last giants, if their deaths ended the bloodlines, then what exactly were they? Where did they truly come from? And why did it take centuries of conflict to finally eliminate them? To understand what LAHMI and his brothers truly represented, we need to go deeper into the ancient sources, not just the biblical texts, but the apocryphal writings, the rabbinical traditions, and the archaeological context that surrounds these narratives. We need to examine the evidence layers that scholars have pieced together over centuries of study. Let's start with what the Bible actually says. In the original languages, not English translations, the Hebrew word Nephilim appears only twice in the entire Hebrew Bible. Once in Genesis 6:4, which we've already examined, and once in Numbers 13:33 in the spies' report from Canaan. The etymology of Nephilim is debated. Some scholars derive it from the Hebrew root naphal, meaning to fall, suggesting fallen ones. Others argue it comes from an Aramaic root meaning giants. Still others suggest it might be a loan word from another ancient language entirely. What's significant is that the biblical text doesn't explain the term. It uses it as if readers already know what it means, as if Nephilim was a recognized category, a known reference that didn't require definition. This suggests the concept was embedded in the cultural understanding of the text's original audience. The Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible completed in the 3rd to 2nd century BCE, translates Nephilim as gigantes, which gives us the English word giants. But the Greek gigantes carries its own mythological baggage. In Greek mythology, the gigantes were offspring of Gaia, earth, and Uranus, sky, beings who warred against the Olympian gods. The translators chose a term their Greek-reading audience would understand, but in doing so, they imported associations that might not have been present in the original Hebrew concept. The Bible doesn't explain who these beings were, but other texts do. The Book of Enoch, which we've mentioned, provides the most detailed account. This text wasn't included in most Jewish or Christian biblical canons, with the notable exception of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which considers it scripture. But its influence on ancient Jewish and early Christian thought was substantial. The New Testament book of Jude quotes from Enoch explicitly, referring to it as a prophecy. Early church fathers like Tertullian and Irenaeus treated it as authoritative. According to Enoch chapter 6:10, 200 watchers descended to earth during the days of Jard, an antediluvian patriarch. The text names their leader as Semjaza and lists 19 other leaders by name. It describes them choosing human wives from among the daughters of men and producing offspring, the Nephilim, who grew to a height of 3,000 cubits. 3,000 cubits. If a cubit is approximately 18 inches, that's 4,500 feet tall. Clearly hyperbolic, symbolic language expressing the idea of beings so large they defied natural order. The text of Enoch describes these Nephilim consuming all the food that humans could produce, then turning on humanity itself. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. Whether this is meant literally or as symbolic language for violence, corruption, and the breakdown of natural boundaries, the message is clear. The Nephilim represented chaos, destruction, a fundamental violation of created order. Enoch continues by describing how God commanded the archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, to bind the watchers and destroy their offspring. The flood narrative in Enoch is presented as the mechanism by which the Nephilim were eliminated from the earth. But here's the crucial detail. Enoch 15:8-11 describes what happened to the spirits of the Nephilim after their bodies died. The text states that because they were not fully human, not fully divine, their spirits couldn't ascend to heaven or descend to the place of the dead. Instead, they became evil spirits that wander the earth, causing harm wherever they can. This concept, that the spirits of dead Nephilim became demons, influenced Jewish and Christian demonology for centuries. Early Christian writers like Justin Martyr, Athenagoras, and Clement of Alexandria all reference this tradition. The idea appears in various forms throughout rabbinical literature. But again, we must frame this carefully. This is what these traditions taught. This is what early Jewish and Christian scholars believe, whether as theology, mythology, or cultural explanation. These narratives shaped how ancient communities understood evil, spiritual warfare, and the origins of malevolent forces in the world. The Bible doesn't explain where demons come from, but the Book of Enoch does, and that explanation became embedded in the interpretive tradition, even among communities that didn't formally recognize Enoch as scripture. Now let's turn to another ancient text, the Book of Jubilees, sometimes called Lesser Genesis. This text, also preserved primarily by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, but known through fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, retells the Genesis narrative with additional details and interpretations. Jubilees 5:1-11 describes the Watchers and their offspring, largely agreeing with the Enochic tradition. But Jubilees adds detail about what happened after the flood. According to Jubilees 10:1-14, after the flood, the spirits of the Nephilim began to lead Noah's descendants astray. Noah prayed for help, and God commanded that most of these spirits be bound, but allowed 1/10 to remain active under the leadership of Mastema, also called Satan in the tradition, to test humanity. This narrative attempts to explain why evil persists after the flood. If the flood was meant to cleanse the earth, why does corruption return? Jubilees answer: the spirits of the Nephilim survived and continue to influence humanity. These apocryphal texts, Enoch, Jubilees, and others, weren't considered authoritative by all Jewish or Christian communities, but they were widely read, widely discussed, and widely influential. They provided explanatory frameworks for understanding biblical passages that otherwise seemed opaque or contradictory, and they provided the context for understanding figures like LAHMI. Because if the Nephilim spirits survived the flood, and if new giants appeared after the flood, the ancient interpreters had to explain the connection. Were the post-flood giants new Nephilim? Or were they humans influenced by Nephilim spirits? Or did the genetic potential for gigantism survive through Noah's line? Different texts suggest different answers, but all agree that the giants in Canaan, the Anakim, the Rephaim, the descendants of Rapha, represented a continuation of the pre-flood problem. Let's examine the biblical terminology more carefully. The word Rephaim appears throughout the Hebrew Bible, but with multiple meanings that scholars still debate. Sometimes Rephaim refers to the dead, to shades or spirits dwelling in Sheol, the realm of the dead. Isaiah 14:9 uses it this way: Sheol below is stirred up to meet you when you come. It rouses the Rephaim to greet you. But other times, Rephaim clearly refers to living giants. Deuteronomy 2:10-11 describes the Emim as Rephaim. Deuteronomy 2:20-21 identifies the Zamzumim as Rephaim. Deuteronomy 3:11 mentions Og, king of Bashan, as the last of the Rephaim, and describes his enormous bed, 9 cubits long, about 13.5 feet. Genesis 14:5 mentions the Rephaim as one of the peoples defeated by Chedorlaomer and allied kings. Joshua 12:4 and 13:12 identify Og's kingdom as the remnant of the Rephaim. Are these the same Rephaim? Or is this a Hebrew word with multiple related meanings, referring both to the giant clans and to the spirits of the dead, perhaps because of a believed connection between them? Scholars debate this, but what's clear is that by the time of David, Rephaim or Rapha had become a designation for giant clans, particularly those in Philistine territory. 2 Samuel 21, 16, 18, 20, and 22 all identify the giants David's men fought as descendants of Rapha, or born to Rapha in Gath. The text treats this as a lineage, a family connection, a bloodline that could be traced. And this brings us back to LAHMI and Goliath. They weren't just large individuals. According to the biblical narrative, they were part of a specific lineage, descendants of Rapha, members of the giant clans that had survived in Philistine territory when Joshua's conquest destroyed them elsewhere. Now let's pause and consider the archaeological evidence. What does the ground tell us? Gath, the city where Goliath and LAHMI came from, has been excavated. The site, identified with Tel-e-Safi in modern Israel, has been under archaeological investigation for decades, with particularly intensive work led by Aaron Meir since 1996. The excavations have revealed a massive city, one of the largest in the region during the Iron Age. The fortifications were enormous. Some of the walls were several meters thick. The city showed evidence of Philistine culture, including distinctive pottery styles and architectural features. But have archaeologists found evidence of giants? Not in the way the biblical text describes. No skeletal remains of 9-foot-tall individuals have been discovered. No tools or weapons scaled to giants have been unearthed. However, the excavations have revealed something interesting. Evidence of people of significant height by ancient standards, and evidence of a culture that venerated size and strength. Some burial sites in Philistine territory have yielded skeletal remains of individuals who stood around 6 feet tall or taller, unusually tall for the ancient Near East, where average male height was closer to 55. While not giants by biblical standards, these individuals would have been imposing figures, towering over their contemporaries. Additionally, Philistine warrior culture, as evidenced by their weapons, armor, and iconography, emphasized physical prowess and martial skill. The Philistines were a militaristic society, likely originating from the Aegean region, possibly related to the Sea peoples mentioned in Egyptian texts, who brought sophisticated military technology and tactics to the Levant. Could the biblical giant narratives be exaggerated memories of particularly tall, well-armed Philistine warriors? Some scholars argue yes, that over time, military defeats by formidable enemies became legendary battles against giants. The 7-foot Philistine warrior becomes 9 feet in cultural memory. The excellent warrior becomes unbeatable. The dangerous enemy becomes supernatural. Other scholars argue that the consistency and detail of the giant traditions suggest something more specific, perhaps a genetic lineage that did produce individuals of extraordinary size, possibly due to conditions like acromegaly or pituitary gigantism, and that these individuals became warriors and leaders, creating a martial elite that dominated Philistine cities like Gath. Still, other scholars take the texts more literally, suggesting that something genuinely anomalous existed, whether explained through genetic, environmental, or other factors, that produced individuals of genuinely extraordinary size. The archaeological evidence doesn't definitively resolve these questions. What it does show is that Gath was a major Philistine stronghold, that the Philistines were formidable military opponents, and that their culture emphasized martial prowess. The Bible doesn't just mention giants in isolation. It connects them to specific geographical locations, creating what we might call a geography of giants. Mount Hermon, on the border between modern Lebanon and Syria, is identified in Enoch as the location where the Watchers descended. This mountain, standing over 9,000 feet tall, was sacred to various ancient people. The Phoenicians worshipped Baal there. The Greeks later built shrines to Pan. Its height and prominence made it a natural location for ancient peoples to imagine as a meeting place between heaven and earth. The Valley of Rephaim, mentioned in Joshua 15:8, was located just southwest of Jerusalem. The name literally means Valley of the Giants. Whether giants actually lived there, or whether the name reflects a tradition about the location, it shows how certain places became associated with giant lore in Israelite geographical understanding. Hebron, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, was associated with the Anakim. Joshua 14:12-15 describes Caleb requesting Hebron as his inheritance specifically because the Anakim were there, and he wanted to drive them out. Numbers 13:22 states that Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, 3 sons of Anak, lived in Hebron when the spies visited. Bashan, the region east of the Jordan River and Sea of Galilee, was ruled by Og, described as the last of the Rephaim. Deuteronomy 3:11 notes that Og's bed was made of iron and measured 9 cubits by 4 cubits. The text adds that this bed could still be seen in Rabbah of the Ammonites, suggesting it was preserved as a curiosity, evidence of an extraordinary figure. And then Gath, the Philistine city where the biblical text concentrates its giant narratives during David's time. All 4 giants mentioned in 2 Samuel 21 came from Gath. Goliath came from Gath. The survivors of the Anakim, according to Joshua 11:22, included those in Gath. This geographical clustering suggests that, according to the tradition, giant populations weren't randomly distributed. They inhabited specific regions, specific cities, specific territories. And over time, as they were defeated or destroyed in most locations, they concentrated in the few places where they survived, ultimately focusing in Philistine territory, particularly Gath. This pattern would explain why David's generation faced multiple giants from a single city. Gath became the last refuge, the final stronghold, the place where the remaining descendants of Rapha gathered or were concentrated. When we examine the giant narratives closely, we notice that the Bible describes different categories or clans of giants, though the relationship between these categories isn't always clear. The Nephilim appear in Genesis 6 and Numbers 13. The name itself becomes almost legendary, the primordial giants, the original corruption. The Anakim appear primarily in the conquest narratives, Joshua's battles, and the spies' report. Numbers 13:33 explicitly connects them to the Nephilim. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. This establishes a genealogical link in the tradition's understanding. The Rephaim appear across multiple time periods and locations. They're described in Genesis 14 as existing in Abraham's time. They're mentioned in Deuteronomy as peoples encountered during Israel's wilderness wandering, and they're identified in 2 Samuel as the lineage of the giants David's men fought. The Emim, Zamzumim, and other groups are mentioned briefly, identified as related to or synonymous with the Rephaim, but with different names used by different peoples. Were these all the same group called different names by different cultures? Or were these distinct clans or families within a broader category of giant people? The biblical text doesn't clarify, and scholars debate the relationships. What emerges from the text is a picture of giant populations that were widespread in the ancient Near East, that were known by various names, and that Israel encountered repeatedly across its history, from the patriarchs, through the Exodus and conquest, into the period of the Judges and the United Monarchy. By David's time, according to the narrative, these populations had been largely eliminated, with only isolated pockets surviving in Philistine territory. Goliath, LAHMI and their brothers represented these final survivors. The biblical text treats the elimination of giants as a divine mandate. This raises difficult ethical questions that deserve careful attention. When Joshua destroys the Anakim, the text presents this as obedience to divine command. When David's men kill the descendants of Rapha, the narrative treats this as righteous warfare. Modern readers often struggle with these passages. They raise questions about genocide, about the morality of destroying entire populations, about how we understand divine justice versus human violence. Different faith traditions and different theological perspectives approach these questions differently. Some argue that the Canaanite populations, including the giants, had become so corrupt, so violent, so harmful that their elimination was necessary for human flourishing. They point to archaeological evidence of child sacrifice in Canaanite religion and other practices that violated what we would now call human rights. Others argue that these narratives reflect ancient Near Eastern conquest ideology, that victorious peoples always claim divine sanction for their conquests, and that we should read these texts as reflecting ancient perspectives rather than eternal moral principles. Still others suggest that the giant narrative specifically, as opposed to the broader conquest narratives, represents something beyond ordinary warfare. If the giants were genuinely connected to the Nephilim, if they represented corrupted bloodlines, if they posed an existential threat to humanity itself, as the traditions claim, then their elimination might be understood differently than ordinary military conflict. These are questions without easy answers. What we can say is that the biblical text itself presents the destruction of the giants as necessary, as commanded, and as completed during David's reign. Whether we accept that framing theologically, interpret it symbolically, or critique it ethically, we must acknowledge that this is how the tradition understood these events. And LAHMI, as one of these final giants, was caught in this narrative. His death at Elhanan's hands was seen not as murder but as warfare, not as crime but as necessity, not as tragedy but as triumph. The text doesn't give us LAHMI's perspective. We don't know what he thought, what he believed, whether he understood himself as part of a cursed bloodline or simply as a Philistine warrior defending his people. We only have the Israelite perspective, which treats his death as righteous victory. Let's consider the military dimensions of these giant battles more carefully. How did ancient warriors actually fight giants? David's approach with Goliath was tactical brilliance, staying at range, using a projectile weapon, targeting the vulnerable point, the forehead, where no armor protected. The text emphasizes that David refused Saul's armor, choosing mobility and his practiced skill over heavy protection. But not all giant battles followed this pattern. The conflicts described in 2 Samuel 21 appear to be closer-range combat, warrior against warrior, where the Israelite soldiers had to match their skill against opponents who had significant physical advantages. Ishbi-Benob targeted David specifically, suggesting an ambush or a planned attack during broader battle chaos. Abishai intervened, creating a 2-on-1 situation that allowed them to overcome the giant warrior. The text doesn't describe how Sibbecai killed Saph, how Elhanan killed LAHMI, or how Jonathan killed the giant with 24 digits. But the fact that these men succeeded suggests they were exceptional warriors who had developed tactics for fighting larger, stronger opponents. Ancient military training emphasized technique over strength. A well-trained swordsman with good footwork, timing, and precision could defeat a stronger but less skilled opponent. The Israelite warriors likely used speed, agility, and tactical thinking to offset their physical disadvantages. But there was also a psychological dimension. The text emphasizes repeatedly that giants inspired terror. The spy's report in Numbers 13 describes the Israelites as feeling like grasshoppers compared to the Nephilim. Goliath's challenge paralyzed the entire Israelite army. No one would face him until David volunteered. Overcoming that fear was itself a victory. The warriors who fought the descendants of Rapha had to conquer terror before they could conquer the enemy. They had to believe victory was possible despite what their eyes told them about the size disparity. This psychological dimension makes the biblical narrative more understandable. If these warriors were genuinely of extraordinary size, whether 7 feet, 9 feet, or somewhere in between, they would have been intimidating in ways that transcended pure physical danger. Their presence alone would demoralize opponents. David's victory over Goliath didn't just eliminate one enemy. It broke the psychological hold that giants had over Israel. It proved they could be defeated. It transformed the giant from an unbeatable threat to just another enemy, dangerous but mortal. And that transformation enabled the later victories. Elhanan could face LAHMI because David had already shown giants could die. Jonathan could face the 6-fingered warrior because precedent existed for victory. The fear was broken, and once fear was conquered, technique could prevail. Ancient Jewish traditions, preserved in sources like the Talmud and various midrashic texts, offer additional perspectives on the giant narratives that aren't found in the biblical text itself. One tradition suggests that Og, king of Bashan, survived the flood by clinging to the outside of Noah's ark. According to this tradition, Noah fed him through a window, and Og lived through the flood despite not being inside the ark with the saved humans and animals. This creative interpretation attempts to explain how a pre-flood giant, since Og is called last of the Rephaim and associated with primordial peoples, could exist in the post-flood world. Another tradition holds that the giants were destroyed not by human warfare alone, but by miraculous intervention, that God confused them, caused them to fight each other, or intervened directly in ways the biblical text doesn't fully describe. Some rabbinical sources suggest that Goliath himself was descended from Orpah, Ruth's sister-in-law, who chose not to follow Naomi back to Israel. According to this tradition, Orpah's descendants included several giants, and her choice to turn away from Israel had long-term consequences that manifested in her warrior descendants. These traditions aren't biblical, but they show how later Jewish scholars grappled with questions the biblical text raises but doesn't answer. Their attempts to create coherent narratives from fragmentary biblical accounts, to explain apparent contradictions, and to extract moral lessons from ancient stories. Christian interpretations added their own layers. Early church fathers saw the Nephilim narrative as evidence of demonic influence in the world. Some connected it to the sons of God, mentioned in Job as being angels, while others interpreted sons of God in Genesis 6 as the godly line of Seth intermarrying with the ungodly line of Cain. This latter interpretation, that sons of God means Seth's descendants, became popular in later Christian tradition partly because it avoided attributing sexual capacity to angels. But earlier Christian writers, including those closest to the time of the New Testament, generally understood sons of God as referring to angelic beings, following the interpretation preserved in Enoch and referenced in Jude. Islamic tradition takes a different approach to these narratives entirely. The Quran doesn't mention the Nephilim or giants in the biblical sense. When it discusses Noah and the flood, it focuses on Noah's prophetic mission, the rejection of his message, and the salvation of believers. The details about watchers, giants, and corrupted bloodlines don't appear in Islamic scripture. Some Islamic scholars familiar with Jewish and Christian traditions have discussed these narratives as part of Israelite history, but not as part of Islamic belief. The Islamic understanding of angels holds that they don't rebel in the way the Watcher narrative describes, that angels don't have free will to disobey in that manner. This creates an interesting dynamic for a documentary like this. We must acknowledge that what biblical and apocryphal traditions describe as history or theology, Islamic tradition would frame differently, either as corruption of earlier revelation, as allegory misunderstood as literal, or as narrative specific to other faith communities. And this brings us back to our framing principle. We're exploring what these ancient texts say and what early communities believed, not claiming universal theological truth. Different faith traditions engage these narratives differently, and that diversity of perspective must be respected. So what do we make of LAHMI in light of all this evidence? Biblical, apocryphal, archaeological, traditional. At minimum, we can say that the biblical text preserves a memory of a warrior named LAHMI, identified as Goliath's brother, who came from Gath and was killed by Elhanan during David's reign. This is historically concrete, names, places, events recorded in what purports to be historical narrative. The text connects LAHMI to a broader tradition about giants in Canaan and Philistia, linking him to the descendants of Rapha, who are connected to the Anakim, who are connected to the Nephilim of Genesis. Whether this genealogical connection is literal, symbolic, or cultural shorthand for formidable warrior from a warrior clan, it places LAHMI within a larger narrative framework. That framework, from Genesis through Chronicles, describes what the tradition understands as a cosmic conflict, not just political or military, but involving boundaries between divine and human, between order and chaos, between covenant faithfulness and corrupted bloodlines. Within that framework, LAHMI represents a final chapter. He's one of the last giants. His death, along with the deaths of the other descendants of Rapha mentioned in the same passage, marks the end of a threat that had persisted for centuries according to the biblical timeline. His name, LAHMI, is preserved precisely because of this significance. He wasn't just another casualty of Israel-Philistine warfare. He was Goliath's brother, part of the giant lineage, one of the final links to a corrupted past that needed to be eliminated before Israel could fully establish itself. And the fact that he wasn't killed by David, but by Elhanan, adds an important dimension to the story. The work of establishing God's kingdom, according to the biblical narrative, wasn't accomplished by heroes alone. It required many faithful people, many skilled warriors, many individuals whose names are briefly mentioned but whose deeds were essential. Elhanan's victory over LAHMI is recorded alongside David's near-death experience with Ishbi-Benob. The passage makes clear that even legendary figures have limits, that they require help, that victory requires community and collective effort, not just individual heroism. This is part of why LAHMI's story matters. In a narrative dominated by the famous David the giant slayer, David the king, David the man after God's own heart, LAHMI's brief appearance reminds us that David didn't accomplish everything alone. He had mighty men. He had warriors like Elhanan who faced their own giants, who won their own victories, who enabled Israel's survival through their courage and skill. The biblical text honors these men by recording their deeds. It doesn't give extensive biographies. It doesn't describe their training, their lives, their thoughts, but it preserves their names and their victories, ensuring that later generations would know it wasn't just David. It was David and his men, together. And LAHMI, by being one of the opponents these men faced, by being significant enough to merit recording, by being Goliath's brother and one of the final giants, becomes part of that story. His death marks an ending, the ending of the giant threat, the completion of Joshua's work, the final elimination of what the tradition describes as corrupted bloodlines. After the battles described in 2 Samuel 21, giants disappear from the biblical narrative. They don't appear again as living enemies. They become history, memory, tradition, stories told to remind later generations of what God did through faithful warriors, of how seemingly impossible obstacles were overcome, of how threats that terrified earlier generations were finally defeated. Whether we understand this literally or symbolically, historically or mythologically, theologically or culturally, the pattern is clear. The biblical narrative presents a movement from threat to victory, from fear to triumph, from the presence of giants to their absence. And LAHMI, brother of Goliath, warrior of Gath, descendant of Rapha, stands at the threshold of that transition, one of the last giants before giants ceased to exist in the biblical world. But there's still more to explore, because the story of giants doesn't end with military defeat. It continues in how later generations remembered, interpreted, and applied these narratives. It continues in questions about what these stories mean for understanding ancient cultures, religious beliefs, and human nature. The giants may have died in the text, but their significance lives on in how we read, understand, and grapple with these ancient narratives that continue to shape billions of lives across multiple faith traditions. What lessons did ancient communities draw from these stories? How did the memory of giants shape Israelite identity, theology, and worldview? And what might these narratives reveal about universal human experiences, our encounters with overwhelming threats, our need for courage in the face of fear, our search for meaning in a world that sometimes seems dominated by forces beyond our control? That is where we turn next, not to the giants themselves, but to what the giants represented, to the deeper meanings embedded in these narratives, and to why the story of LAHMI, almost forgotten by history, deserves to be remembered and understood as more than just a footnote in David's reign. The question that haunts every reader of these ancient texts is simple but profound. What did these stories mean to the people who told them? When an Israelite father in the time of Solomon told his son about the giants, about the Nephilim before the flood, about the Anakim at Canaan's conquest, about Goliath and LAHMI in their grandfather's time, what was he trying to communicate? What lesson, what warning, what understanding was being passed down? We can't know with certainty. We can't interview ancient Israelites about their interpretive frameworks, but we can examine how these narratives function within the larger biblical story, how they connect to themes that appear throughout Israelite tradition, and how later communities understood their significance. Let's start with the most fundamental question. Why does the Bible include giant narratives at all? The biblical text is selective. It doesn't record everything that happened in ancient Israel's history. The authors and editors who compiled these texts made choices about what to include and what to omit, what to emphasize and what to mention briefly. The fact that giant narratives appear across multiple books, Genesis, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Chronicles, suggests they served important functions in Israelite self-understanding. One function is clearly historical memory. The tradition preserves the names and deeds of specific warriors, Goliath, LAHMI, Og, Ahiman, Sheshai, Talma, and records their defeats. These weren't abstract symbols but remembered figures, enemies who were fought and overcome. The detail of their weapons, their sizes, their cities suggests the tradition intended to preserve actual historical information, however much that information might have been shaped by cultural memory and storytelling conventions. But, beyond historical record, these narratives serve theological purposes. They demonstrate divine power working through faithful humans. David defeats Goliath not through superior arms or training, but through faith in God and skillful use of available tools. Joshua's conquest of the Anakim succeeds because God fights for Israel. The elimination of the giants during David's reign completes what God initiated through Joshua. The theological message is consistent. Threats that seem overwhelming, enemies that inspire terror, obstacles that appear insurmountable can be overcome when God's people act in faith and courage. The size of the enemy doesn't determine the outcome. The power of God does. This is why the giant narratives remain powerful across centuries and across cultures. They're not just ancient history. They're paradigmatic stories, patterns that reveal how faith operates, how courage functions, how seemingly impossible situations can be transformed through trust in divine assistance. Every community, every individual faces giants. Maybe not literal 9-foot warriors with bronze armor and iron-tipped spear, but threats that seem too large, problems that appear insurmountable, enemies, whether personal, political, or spiritual, that inspire the same terror the Anakim inspired in the Israelite spies. The giant narratives speak to that universal human experience. They say, yes, the threat is real. Yes, it's larger than you. Yes, you have every reason to be afraid, but fear doesn't determine outcomes. Faith and action do. David didn't deny Goliath's size or strength. He acknowledged it, but he also remembered killing lions and bears while protecting his sheep. He recognized that the giant's size made him slower, less mobile. He identified the vulnerable point, and he acted. That pattern, acknowledging the threat, remembering past victories, identifying advantages, and acting with courage, becomes a template that transcends the specific historical moment. And LAHMI fits into this pattern. He was Goliath's brother, equally formidable, equally terrifying. But Elhanan faced him. Elhanan fought. Elhanan prevailed, not because he was stronger than LAHMI, but because he had the skill, the courage, and, according to the tradition, the divine favor to win. The narrative doesn't make victory automatic. It doesn't say that faith alone, without skill or courage or action, defeats giants. David still had to practice with his sling. Elhanan still had to fight. The mighty men still had to develop their martial abilities, but faith transformed their capabilities, gave them courage to face overwhelming odds, and enabled victories that pure military calculation would have said were impossible. This theological dimension helps explain why these stories persisted, why they were told and retold, why they were written down and preserved even as many other stories from Israel's history were lost or forgotten. But there's another dimension to these narratives that we need to explore, what they reveal about ancient Israelite cosmology, their understanding of how reality was structured, how heaven and earth related, how different orders of being interacted. The giant narratives presuppose a worldview quite different from modern secular materialism. They assume that boundaries between divine and human, between heaven and earth, between different orders of creation could be crossed, sometimes should be crossed, sometimes shouldn't be crossed. Angels appearing to Abraham, wrestling with Jacob, speaking to Moses. These were understood as appropriate crossings, divine beings entering human space for divine purposes. But the Watcher's descent in the Genesis 6 and Enoch narratives represents inappropriate crossing, divine beings acting outside their proper domain, taking human wives, producing offspring that didn't belong in either category. The Nephilim, according to this framework, were category violations, neither fully human nor divine, neither properly part of the created order nor entirely outside it. They represented corruption at a fundamental level, not just moral corruption, but ontological corruption. They were beings who shouldn't exist. This explains the severity of the response described in these traditions. The flood wasn't just punishment for human wickedness, though the biblical text certainly describes human evil as extreme. It was a reset, an attempt to restore proper boundaries, proper categories, proper order to creation. And the persistence of giants after the flood represented the persistence of that corruption. Whether through genetic survival, spiritual influence, or renewed transgression, the problem hadn't been fully resolved. Corrupted bloodlines remained. Category violations continued. The work of restoration remained incomplete. From this perspective, Joshua's command to destroy the Anakim wasn't genocide in the ordinary sense. It was the elimination of ontological corruption, removing from the earth beings whose very existence violated created order. And David's generation completed that work, finally ending the giant bloodlines that had persisted for centuries. Now, we must be careful here. This is how the tradition understood these events. This is the theological framework ancient Israelites used to make sense of these narratives. Whether we accept that framework theologically, whether we interpret it symbolically, or whether we critique it from modern ethical perspectives is a separate question. Different faith traditions approach this differently. Jewish interpretation developed in multiple directions, some literal, some allegorical, some focused on moral lessons rather than historical claims. Christian interpretation similarly varied, with debates about whether Genesis 6 describes angels or human lineages, whether giants were literal or symbolic, whether these narratives teach theological truths or preserve cultural myths. Islamic tradition, as we've noted, doesn't engage these specific narratives as scripture, though Muslim scholars familiar with Jewish and Christian texts have discussed them as part of those traditions' histories. And modern secular scholarship approaches these texts as ancient Near Eastern literature, valuable for understanding how ancient peoples thought, what they feared, how they structured their worldviews, but not necessarily as sources for biological or historical fact about actual giants. All these perspectives can coexist as we study these texts. We can examine what the tradition claims, how ancient peoples understood these stories, what functions these narratives served, and what they reveal about human religious imagination, all without requiring that every reader adopt the same interpretive stance. What's undeniable is that these stories mattered deeply to ancient communities. They shaped how Israelites understood their history, their identity, their relationship with the land of Canaan, and their sense of divine purpose. The giants weren't just enemies. They were symbols of everything that opposed God's order. They represented chaos threatening creation, violence threatening peace, corruption threatening purity. Their elimination was necessary for Israel to fulfill its calling, not just politically, but spiritually and cosmically. And LAHMI, as one of the final giants, symbolized the completion of that necessary work. His death wasn't just another casualty in ongoing warfare between Israel and Philistia. It marked a threshold, the end of the giant age, the final elimination of corrupted bloodlines, the completion of what Joshua had started centuries earlier. Let's consider how these narratives functioned in different periods of Israel's history. During the wilderness wandering, when the spies reported giants in Canaan, the giant narrative served to test faith. Would Israel trust God's promise despite the Nephilim's presence? Or would fear paralyze them? Their failure to trust led to 40 years of wandering, an entire generation dying in the wilderness because they couldn't overcome their fear of giants. This established a pattern. Giants represented tests of faith. They were obstacles that revealed whether God's people would trust divine promises or surrender to fear. During the conquest under Joshua, the giant narratives motivated thoroughness. The command to destroy the Anakim completely, the emphasis on eliminating them from the hill country, the recording of where survivors remained. All this created urgency around finishing the task. Partial obedience wasn't sufficient. The giants had to be completely removed. This established another pattern. Incomplete obedience leads to persistent problems. The survivors in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod became the source of future conflict. What Joshua's generation left undone, David's generation had to complete. During the period of the Judges, when Israel repeatedly fell into apostasy and oppression, the giant narratives reminded them of past victories. They had defeated the Anakim once. They could overcome current enemies too, but it required returning to covenant faithfulness, to trust in God rather than in military might or political alliances. During David's reign, the giant narratives reached their culmination. The systematic defeat of Goliath and his brothers, LAHMI, Ishbi-Benob, Saph, and the unnamed warrior with 24 digits, completed what Joshua started. After these battles, giants disappear from the biblical narrative. The threat was finally eliminated. This established a final pattern. God's purposes may take time, may require multiple generations, but they will be accomplished. What one generation begins in faith, another generation completes. The work of establishing God's kingdom is collective, spanning centuries, requiring many faithful people contributing their parts. And after David, when Israel no longer faced giant enemies but did face other threats, Assyrian invasion, Babylonian conquest, exile, return, occupation by foreign powers, the giant narratives reminded them that they had faced impossible odds before and survived. If their ancestors could defeat the Nephilim's descendants, they could endure whatever challenges they currently faced. The giants became a measure of difficulty, a reference point for impossibility. This problem is as big as a giant meant this seems impossible, but remember, we defeated giants before. We can overcome this too. This is how narratives function in culture. They're not just historical records. They're interpretive frameworks, moral examples, sources of identity and courage. They shape how communities understand themselves, their past, and their possibilities. The story of LAHMI, brief though it is, participates in this larger function. Every time an Israelite father told his son about David's mighty men, Elhanan's name came up. And with Elhanan came LAHMI, Goliath's brother, the giant who fell at Bethlehem warriors' hands. The boy hearing this story learned several things. He learned that giants were real threats his ancestors faced. He learned that these threats could be overcome. He learned that victory didn't come only through the famous heroes, but also through skilled warriors whose names appeared briefly in the records. He learned that his people's survival required courage across generations, from Joshua to David, from the famous to the lesser known. And perhaps most importantly, he learned that he lived in a world cleansed of giants, that his ancestors had completed the work, had eliminated the threats, had made the land safe for him. He inherited not just land but victory, not just tradition but triumph. This is why the giant narratives matter even to readers who don't believe in literal giants. They reveal how a people understood their history, processed their trauma, celebrated their victory, and transmitted courage to future generations. Now let's turn to a question that often troubles readers: the violence in these narratives. The biblical text describes the destruction of the Anakim, the killing of Og and all his people, the deaths of Goliath and his brothers, and it treats these as righteous acts, as victories to celebrate, as necessary eliminations. Modern readers, shaped by humanitarian values, by international law, by awareness of genocide and ethnic cleansing, often recoil from these passages. How can we read texts that seem to celebrate killing? How do we grapple with narratives that present destruction as divinely commanded? These are serious questions that deserve serious engagement. First, we must recognize that ancient warfare was brutal by modern standards. All ancient Near Eastern cultures practiced total warfare. Assyrian reliefs depict impaling captive. Babylonian texts describe razing cities. Egyptian inscriptions boast of slaughtering enemies. The violence in biblical texts isn't unique to Israel. It reflects ancient warfare norms. Second, we should note that biblical texts themselves show developing ethical consciousness. The laws in Deuteronomy regulate warfare, require offering peace before attacking cities, and protect certain categories of people even in war. Prophets like Isaiah envision a future when weapons are turned into farming tools. Jesus teaches love for enemies. The trajectory, across biblical tradition, moves toward restraint, mercy, and peace, even as earlier texts reflect harsher ancient realities. Third, The giant narrative specifically may represent a category different from ordinary warfare. If the giants were understood as corrupted bloodlines, as ontological violations, as threats to creation itself, not just political enemies but cosmic dangers, their elimination might be understood differently than the killing of human enemies. This is similar to how many modern people distinguish between war against human armies and the elimination of dangerous pathogens or invasive species that threaten ecosystems. The giants, in the tradition's understanding, weren't just another ethnic group. They were something other, something that shouldn't exist, that threatened the proper order of creation. But fourth, and perhaps most important, we must acknowledge that these texts have been misused. They've been invoked to justify violence, to dehumanize enemies, to claim divine sanction for atrocities. Any interpretation of these passages must reckon with that history of abuse. Christian crusaders justified violence against Muslims by claiming precedent in Joshua's conquest. European colonizers justified violence against indigenous people by comparing them to Canaanites who deserved elimination. White supremacists have twisted these narratives to support racist ideologies. This misuse doesn't negate the text's value or meaning, but it does require careful, responsible interpretation. We must be clear. These are ancient narratives about specific situations in specific times. They describe what ancient peoples believed God commanded in their circumstances. They don't provide a blanket authorization for violence against anyone we label as other or enemy. The giant narratives, specifically, are about extraordinary threats that ancient Israelites believed required extraordinary responses. They're not templates for how to treat human enemies in general. The same biblical tradition that records the destruction of the Anakim also commands love for neighbors, justice for foreigners, and mercy for the vulnerable. So how do we read these texts responsibly? We read them as ancient documents that reveal how ancient peoples understood their world. We acknowledge what they say without necessarily agreeing with every action they describe or celebrate. We recognize the cultural and historical distance between their world and ours. We extract wisdom about courage, faith, and overcoming obstacles while remaining critically aware of how these texts have been misused. And we can appreciate the literary and theological artistry, how these narratives function within the larger biblical story, how they convey truths about human nature and divine power, how they've shaped religious imagination across millennia, while still maintaining ethical clarity about violence and human dignity. The story of LAHMI in this light becomes both simpler and more complex. Simpler because we can acknowledge the text presents this as a warrior killed in battle, part of a campaign to eliminate threats to Israel's survival. More complex because we must grapple with what it means that this killing is presented as righteous, necessary, and divinely sanctioned. Different readers will resolve that tension differently. Some will trust the text's theological framing completely. Others will view it as ancient ideology that we've morally progressed beyond. Still others will seek middle ground, honoring the text's religious authority while questioning specific applications or interpretations. What matters is engaging these questions honestly rather than ignoring them, wrestling with difficult passages rather than skipping over them, and recognizing that sacred texts can be both valuable and challenging, both instructive and troubling. Let's return now to LAHMI specifically and ask, what makes his story worth remembering? In one sense, nothing. He appears in 2 verses. We know almost nothing about him beyond his name, his relationship to Goliath, his city, his lineage, and his death. Compared to major biblical figures, Abraham, Moses, David, Isaiah, he's a footnote. But that's precisely what makes him interesting. Because the biblical text is selective, when it includes even a brief mention of someone, that inclusion suggests significance. LAHMI's significance lies in what he represents. The completion of the giant narrative, the validation of David's mighty men, the final elimination of the Anakim bloodline, and the transition from legendary heroism to collective achievement. He represents completion because he's one of the last giants mentioned. After the battles described in 2 Samuel 21, giants disappear from biblical narrative. The age of giants ends. What began with the Nephilim before the flood, what continued through the Anakim at conquest, what persisted in isolated pockets during the Judges and early monarchy, finally concludes during David's reign. LAHMI's death marks that conclusion. He validates David's mighty men because defeating him required their skill. David himself was forbidden from going to battle after nearly dying at Ishbi-Benobb's hands. The younger warriors, Elhanan, Sibbecai, Jonathan, had to step forward. They had to prove themselves worthy of their legendary king, capable of continuing the work David started. LAHMI's death proved Elhanan belonged among the mighty men, that his skill matched the challenge. He represents the final elimination of the Anakim bloodline because he's explicitly identified as descended from Rapha, from Gath, from the surviving giants that Joshua's conquest didn't destroy. His death, along with his brothers, meant no more Anakim remained. The work was complete, and he represents the transition from legendary heroism to collective achievement, because his story emphasizes that victory required many warriors, not just David. The young shepherd who killed Goliath became the aging king who needed protection. The legendary giant slayer became the leader whose men fought giants while he organized the kingdom. Individual heroism gave way to organized, collective military capability. This transition is actually crucial for understanding how Israel survived and thrived. Nations built around single heroes often collapse when those heroes die. But nations built around systems, traditions, and capable institutions survive across generations. David's mighty men represented institutional capability. They were trained warriors, proven in battle, capable of independent action. When David could no longer fight personally, his army still functioned. When David eventually died, his trained commander continued serving his son Solomon. LAHMI's death at Elhanan's hands rather than David's symbolizes this transition. The work continues beyond the founding hero. The mission persists across generations. Victory requires building systems and developing people, not just celebrating individual champions. This is a lesson that resonates far beyond ancient warfare. Organizations, movements, nations, communities, all require moving beyond dependence on founding figures toward sustainable systems. The work that matters most requires many people across time, each contributing their part, each building on what came before. LAHMI's story also reveals something about brotherhood and legacy. He was Goliath's brother. That relationship defined how the biblical text identifies him. Not just a giant from Gath, but the brother of Goliath. What was it like to be Goliath's brother? To grow up in his shadow? To know he was the champion, the famous one, the warrior who challenged entire armies? To hear his name spoken with fear and respect throughout Philistia? And then to witness his shocking death, killed by a shepherd boy with a stone? To process that loss, that humiliation, that end to what seemed like invincibility. The text doesn't tell us LAHMI's psychological state, but human nature suggests possibilities. Perhaps he sought revenge. Perhaps he trained harder, determined to avenge his brother's death. Perhaps he felt pressure to live up to the family reputation, to prove that Goliath's death was a fluke, that the giant bloodline remained formidable. Or perhaps he simply was what he was, a warrior from Gath, defending his people against Israelite expansion, whose connection to a famous brother mattered more to his enemies than to himself. We can't know, but the human dimension adds depth to the narrative. These weren't just category, giants versus Israelites. They were individuals with relationships, families, histories, motivations. Goliath and LAHMI were brothers. They grew up together, probably trained together, possibly fought side by side in battles not recorded in the text. Goliath's death left LAHMI without his brother, a loss that would have shaped his remaining years, however many or few they were before Elhanan ended his life. This humanization doesn't change the text's theological framing. The biblical narrative still presents their deaths as necessary, as righteous, as victory, but it reminds us that even enemies in ancient texts were human beings with human experiences: loss, grief, fear, courage, loyalty. Elhanan and LAHMI faced each other as enemies. One killed the other. The text celebrates the killer and dismisses the killed. But both were warriors, both showed courage, both risked everything in combat. In different circumstances, in a different story, they might have respected each other as fellow soldiers who understood the demands of warfare. The tragedy, and it is a tragedy, even within the text's triumphalist framing, is that circumstances made them enemies. The boundaries of ethnicity, religion, and political loyalty placed them on opposite sides. An ancient warfare gave no quarter, offered no mercy, required total commitment to victory or death. Let's consider one final dimension: how later traditions remembered and interpreted these giant narratives. In Jewish tradition, giants became associated with arrogance and rebellion against God. The Midrashic literature expanded on biblical hints, creating elaborate stories about giant pride, their challenges to divine authority, and their inevitable downfall. The message was consistent. No matter how physically powerful, those who oppose God will fail. Og, in particular, became a legendary figure in Jewish tradition. Stories describe him carrying a mountain to drop on Israel's camp, only to have God send a bird whose beak broke through the mountain and trapped Og's head inside. Moses, depicted as having a 10-cubit staff, jumps 10 cubits high and strikes Og's ankle, the only place Moses can reach, and kills him. These fanciful elaborations aren't meant as literal history. They're moral instruction through story. They teach that divine power overcomes any obstacle, that faith enables victories over impossible odds, that physical size means nothing compared to spiritual authority. In Christian tradition, giants often became metaphors for sin, temptation, or spiritual enemies. David's victory over Goliath became a template for Christian victory over sin through faith in Christ. The giant represented any obstacle to faithful living, any temptation that seemed too large to resist, any enemy, physical or spiritual, that opposed God's purposes. Sermons across centuries used giant narratives to encourage believers facing difficulty. You may face giants in your life: illness, poverty, persecution, doubt, but remember David. Remember that God fights for those who trust him. Remember that giants fall. This metaphorical interpretation didn't necessarily deny literal giants existed historically, but it focused on extracting transferable lessons, on finding meaning relevant to contemporary believers who probably wouldn't face literal 9-foot warriors, but would face challenges that felt equally overwhelming. Medieval Christian art depicted David and Goliath frequently, using the story to represent Christ's victory over death or Satan. The small, faithful warrior defeating the large, threatening enemy became a visual metaphor for spiritual triumph. In Islamic tradition, as mentioned earlier, these specific narratives don't appear in the Quran, but Muslim scholars familiar with Israeliyat, traditions from Jewish and Christian sources, sometimes discuss these stories as part of Bani Israel's history. The emphasis, when these stories were referenced, was typically on God's power and the importance of trust in divine promises rather than on the giants themselves. Some Muslim commentators noted parallels between biblical giant narratives and Quranic stories about powerful nations destroyed for their arrogance. The people of Ad, the people of Thamud, Pharaoh's army. The lesson was similar. Physical power without moral righteousness leads to destruction. God destroys those who oppose his messenger, regardless of their strength. This comparative religious approach reveals something important. Different faith traditions find different meanings in similar narratives. Jews, Christians, and Muslims all emphasize divine power and human faith, but they frame the lessons differently, apply them to different contexts, and integrate them into different theological systems. For a documentary exploring these narratives, this diversity enriches understanding. It shows that ancient texts aren't locked into single interpretations. They're living documents that different communities engage with across time, finding relevance in new situations, extracting wisdom for contemporary challenges. The story of LAHMI, brief, violent, ancient, can speak to modern readers in unexpected ways, not because we face literal giants, but because we all face challenges that seem insurmountable. We all encounter situations where we feel like grasshoppers compared to the forces arrayed against us. We all need courage when fear seems rational. And we all live in communities where collective effort matters more than individual heroism, where many people contributing their parts achieves more than any single person could accomplish alone. LAHMI's defeat by Elhanan rather than David teaches exactly this. The famous king doesn't get all the glory. The elite warrior, whose name most people don't remember, plays an essential role. Victory requires many people, many contributions, many acts of courage, some celebrated, most forgotten, all necessary. This is true in every field. Science advances through countless researchers whose names appear only in specialized journals. Social movements succeed through millions of people making small contributions. Nations survive through ordinary citizens doing their jobs competently day after day. The biblical text, by recording Elhanan's victory over LAHMI, honors this reality. It celebrates not just the famous but also the capable, not just the legends but also the professionals, not just David but also David's mighty men. And in doing so, it makes space for every reader to imagine themselves as Elhanan rather than David. Most people aren't legendary. Most people aren't famous. Most people don't have dramatic stories that everyone remembers. But most people at some point face their giant. They encounter their challenge, their test, their moment that requires more courage than they think they possess. And in that moment, the story of Elhanan and LAHMI offers encouragement. You don't have to be David. You don't have to be legendary. You just have to show up, face the giant before you, use the skills you've developed, and trust that your contribution matters even if it never becomes famous. Let's bring all these threads together now as we consider the full significance of the giant narratives, from Genesis through Chronicles, from the Nephilim to LAHMI. These narratives served multiple functions for ancient Israel. They explained the world, why certain places had certain names, why certain peoples were enemies, why certain conflicts persisted. They provided national identity. We are the people who defeated giants. They transmitted values, courage, faith, obedience to divine command. They warned against incomplete obedience. The giants Joshua's generation didn't eliminate became problems for later generations. But beyond these functions, they revealed something about how ancient Israelites understood reality itself. They lived in a world they believed was contested, where divine purposes faced opposition, where created order could be corrupted, where boundaries between different realms could be transgressed. The giants represented that opposition. They were physical manifestations of cosmic rebellion. They were evidence that the flood hadn't completely resolved the corruption introduced before it. They were ongoing threats that required ongoing response across multiple generations. This worldview of contested reality, of cosmic conflict working itself out through historical events, shaped how Israel understood everything. Warfare wasn't just political. It had spiritual dimensions. Enemies weren't just competitors for resources. They could represent fundamental opposition to divine purposes. Victory wasn't just military success. It was participation in God's work of restoring creation to its proper order. Whether we share this worldview today is a different question. Modern secular perspectives often resist these frameworks, preferring explanations based on sociology, politics, economics, and psychology without invoking cosmic category. But understanding how ancient people's thought requires engaging their category, their frameworks, their ways of making sense of experience, even if we don't adopt those frameworks ourselves. The giant narratives, understood in their ancient context, reveal a people who saw their history as meaningful, their conflicts as significant beyond mere political or economic interests, their survival as evidence of divine favor and purpose. And LAHMI, one of the final figures in these narratives, represents the completion of that cosmic story. His death marked the end of the giant age. After him, Israel no longer faced these particular enemies. The threat was eliminated. The work was complete. Of course, Israel faced many other threats afterward. Arameans, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans. The list of enemies is long, but none of them were giants. None of them represented the specific cosmic threat that the Nephilim descendants symbolized. The giant narratives ended because the giants ended. The story reached its conclusion. What began with mysterious beings descending to Mount Hermon, what continued through the flood and its aftermath, what persisted in Canaan despite Joshua's efforts, finally concluded when Elhanan, Sibbecai, and Jonathan killed the last descendants of Rapha and Gath. This is satisfying narratively. It provides closure. It demonstrates that persistent faithfulness across generations accomplishes purposes that single generations cannot. It honors both the legendary David and the capable Elhanan. It marks a transition point in Israel's history from conquest to consolidation, from eliminating existential threats to managing ongoing political relationships. And it teaches a lesson that resonates across time. Impossible challenges can be overcome, but it requires persistence, courage, skill, and often many people contributing across time. So what do we conclude about LAHMI, Goliath's forgotten brother? He was, according to the biblical tradition, a giant warrior from Gath, descended from bloodlines that traced back to the Anakim and ultimately to the Nephilim. He wielded a massive spear like his famous brother. He fought against Israel during David's reign, and he died in combat against Elhanan, one of David's elite warriors. His name survives in 2 biblical verses, mentioned briefly, without elaboration, as one of 4 giants killed during this period. Most readers skip over him without notice. Most sermons never mention him. Most studies of David's reign focus on more famous figures and events. But his brief appearance matters for exactly the reasons we've explored. He represents completion, transition, collective achievement, and the reality that victory requires many people, not just heroes. His story, though brief, participates in a narrative arc spanning from Genesis to Chronicles, from before the flood to the establishment of David's dynasty. And perhaps most importantly, his story reminds us to look beyond the famous, beyond the obvious, beyond the dramatic moments everyone remembers. In the margins of biblical narrative, in the brief mentions and passing references, we find other stories, other people, other dimensions of meaning that enrich our understanding. Elhanan defeated LAHMI. That single sentence, preserved across millennia, honors a warrior whose name most people don't know, celebrates a victory most people don't remember, and marks the end of an age most people don't recognize. But for those who look carefully, who read closely, who ask questions about the figures barely mentioned, for those people, LAHMI's story reveals something important about how narratives work, how traditions preserve meaning, and how even forgotten figures contribute to larger stories that shape our world. The giants are gone from the biblical narrative after David, but their memory persists. Their story continues to be told, and figures like LAHMI, almost forgotten but not quite, remain part of that story, testimonies to conflicts ancient peoples believed they faced, victories they believed they won, and divine assistance they believed enabled their survival. These ancient texts, the Bible, the apocryphal writings, the traditions preserved across millennia, offer a window into how our ancestors understood their world. Whether we read them as history, allegory, theology, or cultural memory, they remain powerful narratives that shaped and continue to shape billions of lives. The questions they raise about human nature, divine justice, the boundaries of creation, the price of forbidden knowledge, the challenge of overcoming overwhelming obstacle, are questions every generation must answer for itself. What actually happened in those ancient days? Did giants truly walk the earth as the texts describe? Were they symbolic representations of other threats? Were they exaggerated memories of powerful enemies? Did events unfold as the biblical narrative claims, or did later tradition reshape memories into mythological patterns? Perhaps that matters less than what these stories reveal about us. Our fears, our longings, our eternal search for meaning in a mysterious world. Perhaps the value lies not in settling historical questions with certainty, but in grappling with narratives that have moved human hearts and shaped human societies for thousands of years. The story of LAHMI, brother of Goliath, brief though it is, participates in that larger narrative tradition. His death marked an ending, the end of the giant age, the completion of work spanning generations, the final elimination of threats that had haunted Israel since Joshua's conquest and, according to tradition, since before the flood itself. He died by Elhanan's hand, not David's. His story honors the capable rather than just the legendary. His brief appearance reminds us that victory requires many people, many contributions, many acts of courage, most forgotten, all necessary. And in remembering him now, in telling his story, in exploring what his brief appearance in biblical narrative reveals about ancient beliefs and human experience, we honor not just LAHMI himself, but all the forgotten figures whose contributions mattered, whose courage made a difference, whose names survive only in passing mentions but whose deeds shaped the world. The giants may be gone from our world, if they ever existed outside of ancient texts and cultural memory, but the challenges they represented, the overwhelming obstacles, the terrifying enemies, the seemingly impossible situations, those remain part of human experience across time. And the lesson of the giant narratives, that faith, courage, skill, and persistence can overcome even the most daunting challenges, especially when many people work together across generations. That lesson remains relevant wherever humans face difficulties that seem too large, too strong, too entrenched to defeat. This is the legacy of biblical giant narratives, from the Nephilim to the Anakim to Goliath and his brothers. This is why these stories persist, why they're still told, why they still move readers thousands of years after the events they describe, or claim to describe, or remember, or imagine. And this is why LAHMI, Goliath's forgotten brother, deserves to be remembered, not because his individual story is dramatic, it's not, but because he represents something larger, the completion of ancient work, the validation of collective effort, and the reality that history is made not just by legends, but by capable people whose names appear briefly before fading into the past, yet whose contributions shaped everything that came after. In the end, perhaps that's the most important lesson these ancient narratives teach. Every contribution matters, every act of courage counts, every person facing their giant, whether famous or forgotten, participates in larger stories that extend beyond individual lifetimes and shaped the world in ways we can't fully measure or predict. The age of giants ended, according to biblical tradition, when David's mighty men defeated the last descendants of Rapha and Gath. LAHMI fell. The threat was eliminated. The story reached its conclusion. But the meaning of that story, the courage it celebrates, the faith it honors, the lessons it teaches about overcoming impossible odds and working together across generations, that meaning persists, waiting for each new reader to discover it, to apply it to their own challenges, and to pass it on to the next generation. That is the lasting significance of LAHMI, Goliath's forgotten brother, whose name survives in 2 biblical verses, and whose death marked the end of an ancient age. And yet, there's more to this story than we've explored, because the giant narratives don't exist in isolation. They're part of a broader ancient Near Eastern context, a world where many cultures told stories about giants, divine beings, and the distant past when things were different. Let's step back and consider what archaeology and comparative literature tell us about giants in the ancient world beyond the biblical text. The Mesopotamians, Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians preserved traditions about the distant past when the gods walked among humans. The Sumerian king list describes rulers before the flood who reigned for thousands of years. The Epic of Gilgamesh presents its hero as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, possessed of extraordinary strength and size. Mesopotamian texts describe the Anunnaki, divine beings who descended from heaven to earth. These aren't identical to biblical narratives, but they share common themes. A distant past when boundaries between divine and human were more fluid, when extraordinary beings existed, when the world was fundamentally different from the present age. The Egyptians told of the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, who ruled Egypt before the human pharaohs. They described gods incarnating in human form, walking among mortals, producing offspring. Their mythology was filled with beings who transcended ordinary human limitations. The Greeks and Romans preserved extensive mythology about titans, giants, and demigods, offspring of gods and humans who performed extraordinary feats. These stories, like biblical giant narratives, described beings who belonged fully to neither divine nor human categories, whose existence created problems, and who ultimately had to be defeated or destroyed. The Hittites, the Canaanites, the Phoenicians, all the cultures surrounding ancient Israel, had similar traditions. The pattern is consistent across the ancient Near East. Memories or myths of a time when the world was different, when boundaries were crossed, when beings of extraordinary power and size walked the earth. This doesn't mean all these traditions describe the same events. It means ancient Near Eastern peoples shared similar frameworks for understanding their world, their past, and the relationship between divine and human realms. They used similar narrative structures to express ideas about origins, boundaries, corruption, and divine intervention. The biblical giant narratives participate in this broader cultural context. They're not unique inventions, but Israelite versions of widespread ancient Near Eastern traditions, adapted to serve Israel's particular theological perspectives and historical experiences. What makes the biblical version distinctive is its emphasis on monotheism and covenant. In Mesopotamian myths, multiple gods compete and conflict. In Greek mythology, the gods are flawed, petty, and often immoral. But in biblical tradition, one God establishes order, sets boundaries, intervenes to preserve creation when those boundaries are violated. The giants in biblical narrative aren't just powerful enemies. They represent violation of divinely established order. Their elimination isn't just military conquest. It's restoration of proper boundaries, proper categories, proper relationship between heaven and earth. This theological distinctiveness matters for understanding what the texts meant to ancient Israelites. They weren't just telling entertaining stories about battles with large enemies. They were expressing deep convictions about how reality should be structured, about God's commitment to preserving creation, and about Israel's role in participating in divine purposes. LAHMI, within this framework, represents more than just an individual warrior. He symbolizes the final remnant of corrupted order, the last link to a past that needed to be left behind, the concluding chapter of a story that began with boundaries being crossed and ended with boundaries being restored. Let's consider how these narratives influenced later Jewish thought, particularly in the Second Temple period, the centuries between Israel's return from Babylonian exile and the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple by Rome in 70 CE. During this period, Jewish writers produced extensive literature exploring the giant narratives and their implications. We've mentioned Enoch and Jubilees, but there were many other texts. The Book of Giants, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, various testaments and apocalypses, rabbinic midrashim that expanded biblical stories with imaginative details. These texts show that giants remained important in Jewish imagination long after they disappeared from Israel's actual experience. Why? Because the giant narratives addressed perennial questions. Where does evil come from? Why does corruption persist? How do we understand beings or forces that seem more than human? What's our responsibility when facing overwhelming opposition? The Dead Sea Scrolls community at Qumran, for instance, appears to have been intensely interested in giant traditions. Multiple fragments of Enochic literature were found in the caves, along with texts like the Book of Giants that aren't preserved elsewhere. This suggests that at least some Jews in the 1st century BCE and 1st century CE saw these traditions as highly relevant to understanding their world. They lived under Roman occupation. They witnessed their nation subjugated by what seemed like overwhelming military power. The giant narratives offered interpretive frameworks. Just as Israel's ancestors faced impossible odds and prevailed through faith, so might they. Just as ancient giants were defeated despite their size and strength, so might Rome fall despite its apparent invincibility. This is how sacred narratives function in communities under stress. They provide hope by showing that what seems permanent can change, that what seems impossible can happen, that faith and courage matter even when circumstances suggest otherwise. Early Christianity inherited these Jewish interpretive traditions. The New Testament references Enoch explicitly in the Book of Jude. Early Christian writers like Justin Martyr, Athenagoras, Tertullian, Irenaeus, and Clement of Alexandria all discuss the Watcher narrative and its implications. For early Christians, the giant narratives helped explain the origin and nature of evil. If demons were spirits of dead Nephilim, as Enochic tradition taught, then spiritual warfare made sense. Christians weren't just fighting human enemies or abstract concepts, but actual spiritual beings with agency and malevolent intent. This framework shaped Christian demonology for centuries. Exorcism practices, spiritual warfare theology, understandings of temptation and sin, all were influenced by traditions about the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the spirits that supposedly survived the flood. Whether these interpretations are theologically correct is debated across Christian traditions, but historically, they demonstrate how the giant narratives continued to matter long after the events they describe, shaping how communities understood reality, evil, and spiritual dimensions of existence. The figure of LAHMI, though never mentioned in later Jewish or Christian literature explicitly, participates in this larger tradition. Every time someone taught about the giants of Canaan, about how Israel's survival required eliminating corrupted bloodlines, about how David's generation completed Joshua's work, LAHMI was implicitly part of that story, even if his name wasn't specifically invoked. Let's turn now to a question we've touched on but haven't fully explored: the textual problem of 2 Samuel 21:19 and how ancient and medieval scholars grappled with it. Remember, 2 Samuel 21:19 in the Hebrew text appears to say that Elhanan killed Goliath, not his brother. But 1 Chronicles 20:5 clearly states Elhanan killed LAHMI, brother of Goliath. How did ancient readers handle this apparent contradiction? Jewish tradition proposed several solutions. Some rabbinic sources suggested that Elhanan was actually another name for David himself, that David had multiple names, and the Chronicles account clarifies what the Samuel account leaves ambiguous. This would resolve the contradiction by making them the same event with the same person. However, this solution creates its own problems. The text in 2 Samuel 23 lists Elhanan among David's mighty men, treating him as a distinct person. The genealogical details don't match, and it seems forced to argue that a text identifying someone as Elhanan son of Jair from Bethlehem actually means David son of Jesse from Bethlehem. Other Jewish scholars acknowledge this as a textual corruption, letters dropped or confused during manuscript transmission. Hebrew manuscript tradition recognized that scribal errors occurred, and that sometimes different manuscript traditions preserved different readings. The Masoretes, who standardized the Hebrew text around the 6th to 10th centuries CE, noted various textual issues through their marking system. Christian scholars faced the same problem. Some early Christian writers either didn't notice the discrepancy or chose not to address it. Others proposed harmonizing solutions similar to Jewish approaches, that Elhanan was David's other name, or that the Samuel text was corrupted. Medieval Christian scholars, working with both Hebrew texts and the Latin Vulgate translation, noted the problem explicitly. They generally favored the Chronicles reading as more likely original, understanding the Samuel text as containing a scribal error. Modern textual criticism, comparing manuscript traditions, analyzing linguistic patterns, studying how scribal errors typically occur, strongly supports the Chronicles reading. The transformation of LAHMI, brother of Goliath, into just Goliath can be explained through specific letter confusions that occur in Hebrew script. The presence of the word orgim, meaning weavers, in the Samuel text but not in Chronicles also suggests textual corruption in Samuel. What's significant for our purposes is that this textual problem didn't prevent the tradition from recognizing LAHMI's existence. Chronicles preserves his name. The tradition understood that multiple giants from Gath were defeated. Even if the Samuel text was corrupted, the broader narrative remained clear. Goliath had brothers, they were formidable warriors, and David's mighty men defeated them. This reminds us that ancient texts went through complex transmission processes. We don't have original manuscripts of biblical books. We have copies of copies with variants between manuscript traditions. Most of these variants are minor, spelling differences, word order, small additions or omissions. But occasionally, like in 2 Samuel 21:19, more significant corruption occurred. The fact that we can identify and analyze these issues doesn't undermine the text's value. It reminds us to read carefully, to compare parallel passages, to acknowledge textual complexity while still extracting meaning and wisdom from traditions preserved across millennia. LAHMI's name survives because Chronicles preserved it correctly, even though Samuel's text was corrupted. Without Chronicles, we might not know his name at all. We'd only know that multiple giants were defeated, with confusing details about who killed whom. The dual testimony, despite its complications, actually enriches our understanding. Now let's explore an angle we haven't fully developed. What was life like in Gath, the city where these giants lived? Archaeological excavations at Tel-e-Safi, identified as biblical Gath, have revealed a massive fortified city occupying a strategic location between the coastal plain and the Judean hills. The site shows occupation from the Chalcolithic period, 5th millennium BCE, through the Crusader period, with particular prominence during the Iron Age, exactly when the biblical giant narratives are set. The Philistine layers at Gath reveal a sophisticated urban culture. The fortifications were massive. Some sections of the city wall were 4 meters thick. The city covered an area of around 50 hectares, making it one of the largest sites in the region during the 10th–9th centuries BCE. Pottery from Gath shows Aegean influences, supporting the tradition that Philistines originated from the Mediterranean world, possibly from Crete, Cyprus, or the Greek mainland. They brought with them advanced ceramic technology, distinctive architectural styles, and sophisticated metallurgical knowledge, particularly for iron working. The biblical text's emphasis on Philistine iron weapons makes sense archaeologically. While Israel was still primarily using bronze, the Philistines had mastered iron technology, giving them significant military advantages. Goliath's iron-tipped spear wasn't just large, it represented cutting-edge military technology. Excavations have also revealed cultic installations, suggesting the Philistines worshipped deities including Dagon, mentioned in the Bible, Baal-zebub, and possibly Astarte. Their religious practices differed from Israelite monotheism, creating not just political, but also religious boundaries between the communities. What about giants specifically? The archaeological evidence doesn't support populations of uniformly oversized individuals, but several findings are suggestive. Some burial sites contain individuals who would have stood around 6 feet tall, significantly above average for the period. While not giants by biblical standards, these individuals would have been imposing. More intriguingly, some architectural features at Gath seem scaled slightly larger than typical. Doorways, ceiling heights, and furniture remnants occasionally suggest occupants of above-average size. This could indicate that at least some buildings housed unusually tall individuals, or it could simply reflect elite construction with more spacious accommodations. The text describes the giants coming specifically from Gath, rather than being distributed evenly across Philistine territory. Archaeological patterns support concentration rather than even distribution. Certain buildings, certain quarters of the city show distinctive features that might correlate with elite warrior classes or special populations. We must be careful not to read biblical narratives directly into archaeological remains, but we can say that Gath was a major military power, a center of advanced technology, and a city with resources to support specialized warrior classes. Whether those warriors included genetic giants, exceptionally tall individuals, or simply elite soldiers remembered as giants by defeated enemies, Gath clearly was the military powerhouse the biblical texts describe. For LAHMI, growing up in Gath meant being part of a sophisticated urban culture with advanced military capabilities. He would have been trained from youth in warfare, equipped with the best weapons available, and integrated into a martial culture that valued size, strength, and battlefield prowess. His identification as brother of Goliath suggests family connections mattered in Gath's military structure, that warrior families possibly passed down training, equipment, and reputation across generations. Goliath's fame would have enhanced his family's status. His death would have brought pressure on surviving family members to maintain or restore that reputation. This urban, militaristic context makes LAHMI's story more concrete. He wasn't a mythical creature dwelling in wilderness. He was a soldier from a powerful city, part of an advanced military system, fighting to defend his people against Israelite expansion. The biblical text treats his death as victory, but from Gath's perspective, it was loss. Another warrior fallen, another defender gone, the slow erosion of military capability that eventually left the city vulnerable to conquest. Let's consider the broader geopolitical context. The battles described in 2 Samuel 21 occurred during a period of sustained conflict between Israel and Philistia. David's reign marked Israel's emergence as a regional power, expanding from tribal territories into a kingdom that controlled significant portions of Canaan. This expansion inevitably brought conflict with Philistia, which had dominated the region for generations. The Philistines had superior military technology, fortified cities, and organized military structures. Israel under David was still developing these capabilities, relying more on guerrilla tactics, tribal alliances, and the emerging institution of professional military forces, David's mighty men. The giant battles weren't isolated events. They occurred within broader military campaigns. When the text says there was another battle with the Philistines at Gob, it's describing sustained warfare, not single encounters. Armies clashed repeatedly. Casualties mounted on both sides. Territory changed hands. Within this larger context, individual combats between champions took on outsized significance. When Goliath challenged Israel to single combat, he was following ancient Near Eastern traditions of representative warfare. Let two champions fight. Let their battle determine the outcome. Spare the larger armies. David's acceptance and victory had military consequences beyond just killing one enemy. Similarly, when Ishbi-benob targeted David specifically, when LAHMI fought Elhanan, when other giants faced Israelite warriors, these weren't random encounters. They were strategic targeting, attempts to eliminate enemy leadership, personal vendettas possibly, and certainly battles that carried psychological impact beyond their immediate military significance. Defeating giants demoralized Philistine forces. It demonstrated that size and strength didn't guarantee victory. It validated Israelite warfare methods, and it removed formidable warriors who had probably been battlefield dominators for years. From Israel's perspective, eliminating the giants was both militarily and theologically necessary. Militarily, these warriors posed genuine threats, better armed, better trained, physically imposing, experienced in combat. Theologically, they represented corrupted bloodlines that needed elimination. From Philistia's perspective, losing these warriors weakened their military capability at a crucial moment when Israel was expanding. The giant deaths contributed to Philistine decline, to their eventual subordination under David's kingdom, and to the shift in regional power balance. LAHMI's death, within this geopolitical context, was one event among many contributing to Israel's rise and Philistia's relative decline. Individually, he was one warrior. Collectively, he and his brothers represented Philistia's elite military capability. Their elimination in battles across David's reign significantly weakened Philistine resistance. Let's examine one more dimension: the role of memory and oral tradition in preserving these narratives. The events described in 2 Samuel 21 probably occurred around 980–970 BCE, during David's later reign. The text of 2 Samuel was likely compiled centuries later, possibly during the Babylonian exile, 6th century BCE, or the return period, though it may incorporate earlier written sources. This means the giant narratives were transmitted for centuries, first orally, then in written form, then copied and recopied across generations of scribes. How reliable is this transmission? What happened to the stories during centuries of retelling? Modern scholarship on oral tradition suggests that ancient cultures developed sophisticated mechanisms for preserving information across generations. Not word-for-word memorization necessarily, but structured narratives with key details that remained stable even as specific wordings varied. The giant narratives show evidence of this process. Core elements remain consistent: names Goliath, LAHMI, Og. Locations Gath, Hebron, Bashan. Physical descriptions: spears like weaver's beams, extraordinary height, and outcomes, all defeated by Israelite warriors. but exact details sometimes vary between parallel accounts. The names of giants' fathers sometimes differ slightly between passages. The precise measurements vary between manuscript traditions. Some details appear in one account but not in parallel passages. This suggests the stories were transmitted through communities that preserved core memories while allowing minor variations in detail. What this means for understanding LAHMI is that his core story, brother of Goliath, warrior from Gath, killed by Elhanan, likely preserves genuine historical memory, even if we can't verify every detail with certainty. The tradition considered him significant enough to remember and record, which suggests he mattered in ways we've been exploring. The fact that his name might have been corrupted in one manuscript tradition, 2 Samuel, while preserved in another Chronicles, actually demonstrates textual complexity rather than undermining historicity. If later writers were simply inventing these stories, they probably would have harmonized them completely. The textual variants suggest multiple genuine traditions being preserved, with occasional transmission errors that textual critics can identify and analyze. This brings us to a final reflection on why these ancient narratives continue to fascinate modern readers, including those who don't accept them as literal history or share the theological frameworks that produced them. Stories about giants appear across human cultures: Norse mythology, Native American traditions, Pacific Islander legends, African folklore. The consistency suggests something universal in human imagination. Some need to tell stories about beings larger than ourselves who once walked the earth but are now gone. Psychologically, giants might represent multiple things: childhood memories of adults who seemed enormous from a child's perspective, encounters with unusually tall individuals who stood out in their communities, metaphors for overwhelming challenges, symbols of threats that seemed insurmountable. The biblical giant narratives tap into these universal themes while shaping them according to Israelite theological and historical concerns. They're not just about physical size, but about boundaries, about corruption, about the ongoing struggle to maintain order against chaos. And they're ultimately stories about human courage and divine power. Small David defeats large Goliath. Ordinary warriors overcome extraordinary enemies. Faithful people, across generations, accomplish what seems impossible when they work together with divine assistance. These themes resonate regardless of one's stance on the narrative's historicity. Whether LAHMI was a 9-foot giant, a 7-foot warrior, or simply a formidable opponent remembered as larger than life, his story participates in universal human storytelling about facing fear, overcoming obstacles, and finding courage when circumstances seem overwhelming. This is why the giant narratives remain powerful. They speak to something deep in human experience: the need to confront what terrifies us, the possibility of victory despite overwhelming odds, the importance of courage and skill and faith, and the reality that significant accomplishments require many people working across time. LAHMI, Goliath's forgotten brother, killed by Elhanan in a battle most people don't remember, stands as a testament to all these themes. His brief appearance in sacred text honors both him, a warrior who fought courageously even though his cause was lost, and Elhanan, a skilled fighter whose victory mattered even though his name isn't famous. In remembering LAHMI now, in telling his story, in exploring what his brief mention reveals about ancient beliefs, textual transmission, cultural memory, and human nature, we participate in an act as old as humanity itself, honoring those who came before, learning from their stories, finding meaning in narratives that connect us to our past and illuminate our present. The giants may be gone, if they ever existed as the texts describe, but their stories remain, preserved in ancient documents, transmitted across millennia, still speaking to hearts that need courage, still teaching lessons about faith and persistence, still reminding us that no challenge is too large when faced with courage, skill, and hope. This is the legacy of the biblical giant narratives, from Genesis to Chronicles, from the Nephilim to LAHMI. This is why we still tell these stories, still study these texts, still find meaning in passages written thousands of years ago about events even older. And this is why LAHMI deserves to be remembered, not as a villain, not as a monster, but as a warrior whose story, brief though it is, illuminates larger truths about courage, conflict, memory, and the enduring human need to tell stories about giants and those who defeated them.